The bomb exploded at 9:20 post-meridiem on November 8, 1939. Georg Elser, a carpenter from Württemberg, had spent 30 nights hollowing out a pillar in the Bürgerbräukeler beer hall in Munich. He'd calculated everything perfectly: the angle of the blast, the structural weakness of the ceiling, the exact moment when Adolf Hitler would stand at the podium for his annual speech commemorating the failed beer hall putsch of 1923. Elsa had timed the detonation mechanism with watchmaker precision. The explosion brought down 600 pounds of rubble exactly where Hitler should have been standing. But Hitler wasn't there. He'd left 13 minutes earlier, citing fog conditions that might delay his train back to Berlin. The official story is neat. Weather. Travel logistics. Simple luck. What the official story doesn't mention is what happened in the 8 weeks that followed, when 3 separate German generals reported seeing Hitler in 3 different locations on the same night, or why the Gestapo seemed more interested in finding skilled theatre actors than in tracking down Elsa's potential co-conspirators. The near-miss in Munich didn't just save Hitler's life, it changed the nature of the war that was already beginning, because within 72 hours of that explosion, a different kind of recruitment began across Nazi Germany. The SS weren't looking for soldiers, they were looking for ghosts. Andreas Kroner was 28 years old when he disappeared. Not disappeared in the way people vanished in Nazi Germany. No midnight knock on the door, no transport to Dachau, no whispered explanations to frightened neighbours. Kroner, a moderately successful actor at the Burg Theatre in Vienna, simply failed to appear for a Wednesday matinee of Goethe's Faust. His understudy took the role. The theatre director received a telegram expressing Kroner's regrets. His landlady was told he'd accepted a film opportunity in Berlin. 3 days later, his parents received a visit from 2 Wehrmacht officers bearing tragic news. Andreas had been killed in a traffic accident. The body had already been cremated per public health regulations. Here was his death certificate. Here was a small pension. The officers were very sorry for their loss. His mother noticed something strange. The death certificate listed Andreas as 2 inches taller than he actually was, and gave his eye colour as blue when they were distinctly hazel. She mentioned this to the officers. They suggested grief sometimes confused memories of loved ones. They suggested it would be unwise to contest official documentation. They suggested some silences were patriotic. Andreas Kroner's mother never spoke of her son's height or eye colour again. But here's what the records don't tell us. In that same week, in November 1939, 17 other young men disappeared from theatres, cabarets, and music halls across Greater Germany. All were between 25 and 35 years old. All were between 5 feet 6 inches and 5 feet 9 inches tall. All had dark hair, or could pass for having dark hair with the right treatment. All bore at least a passing resemblance to someone their families would never see again. And all of them, according to official records, died in separate accidents within 10 days of each other. The statistical probability of 17 actors dying accidentally in 17 different German cities within 240 hours is approximately 1 in 47 million. Unless, of course, they didn't die at all. 700 miles to the northwest, in a manor house in Hampshire that maps still listed as the private residence of Baron Willoughby, a very different kind of training was underway. The students there, 9 of them initially, had been recruited through channels so discreet that most couldn't remember exactly how they'd been approached. An idle conversation in a theatre green room, a letter delivered to a dressing room with no return address, a phone call from a man who knew far too much about their private lives and made it clear that declining his invitation would be inadvisable. They arrived at Willoughby Manor expecting some form of war work, entertainment for troops perhaps, morale programming for the BBC. What they found instead was a curriculum that began with something far stranger. Gentlemen, their instructor began on the first morning, you are going to learn to become someone who already exists. The instructor, they were never told his real name, was a former stage director who'd worked in London's West End before the war. He had an actor's bearing but a soldier's eyes. On a table in front of him sat a gramophone, a film projector, boxes of photographs, and something that looked disturbingly like medical instruments. Some of you have noticed the cigars arranged on the table. Romeo y Julieta, Cuban, a specific size called the Churchill. You will each smoke 140 of these cigars over the next 6 weeks. You will learn to hold them precisely at a 42-degree angle. You will master the specific method of rotating them while speaking. Several of you will vomit from the nicotine. This is expected. One of the students, a music hall performer named Norman Shelley, raised his hand. Who exactly are we supposed to be? The instructor smiled without warmth. Mr. Shelley, you're going to become the voice of Britain. The rest of you will serve as understudies. He switched on the gramophone. Winston Churchill's voice filled the room, that famous growl, the distinctive lisp on the sounds, the theatrical pauses that turned speeches into performances. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds. The students listened. Several of them unconsciously began mimicking the rhythm, the inflection. Shelley's lips moved silently, matching the speech word for word. The Prime Minister, the instructor continued, broadcasts to the nation regularly. These broadcasts are crucial to morale, but the Prime Minister is also needed in bunkers during air raids, in Parliament during sessions, in meetings that last 18 hours and cannot be interrupted for radio addresses. The Prime Minister cannot be in 2 places at once. He paused, letting the implication settle. Unless, of course, he can. What the instructor didn't tell them, what they wouldn't learn until much later, was that the program had been personally ordered by Churchill himself after he'd studied intelligence reports about the Munich bombing. The Führer had nearly died, and Churchill, reading between the lines of German communications intercepted by Bletchley Park, had detected something in the Nazi response that looked less like relief and more like activation, as if the near-death had triggered protocols that had already been prepared, as if the Germans had planned for this exact contingency. Churchill didn't believe in coincidences. He believed in matching your enemy's capabilities and exceeding them. The double school at Willoughby Manor would run for 6 years. By the time it closed in 1945, it would train 23 different men to be Winston Churchill, each one specialized for different contexts. Radio voices, photographic appearances, personal meetings with specific foreign dignitaries who'd never met the real Prime Minister. But in November 1939, none of them knew this yet. They only knew they'd been brought to a manor house that didn't officially exist, to learn how to stop being themselves. Norman Shelley was the best. His voice could fool Churchill's own secretary, but late at night, in his small room on the manor's 3rd floor, he would sometimes practice Churchill's speeches in front of a mirror and feel something cold move through him. He was becoming someone else, and the someone else was becoming real. In Moscow, the paranoia was older and ran deeper. Joseph Stalin had employed body doubles since 1934, the year Sergei Kirov was assassinated in Leningrad. The murder had spooked Stalin in ways that even the chaos of the revolution hadn't. If they could kill Kirov loyal, popular Kirov, then nowhere was safe. No one could be trusted. The first double had been a Georgian actor named Riza Zekariadze, who bore a resemblance to the young Stalin. The transformation had been crude makeup, costume, coached posture. Zekariadze appeared at factory openings and military parades while Stalin worked in the Kremlin. The deception lasted 6 months before Zekariadze made a mistake, addressing a general by the wrong name at a public event. He was shot the same night. But Stalin had learned something valuable. The concept worked. It simply needed refinement. By 1939, as Hitler's Wehrmacht massed on Poland's borders, Stalin employed 3 active doubles. But the German threat, the treaty with Hitler notwithstanding, pushed the program into new territory. The NKVD began recruiting not from actors but from labor camps, finding men with the right build and breaking them psychologically before reshaping them into the leader. The supervising physician was Vladimir Filatov, a pioneer in corneal transplant surgery who developed experimental techniques for facial reconstruction. What Filatov did in the basement laboratories of Lubyanka prison would remain classified for 70 years. Even when the Soviet archives opened, the files on the double program were redacted so heavily that whole pages were simply black rectangles. But certain facts emerged through the testimony of survivors. The doubles underwent surgery without anesthesia, the pain itself considered part of the conditioning. Bone structures were altered using techniques that wouldn't be seen in Western medicine for another 30 years. Teeth were pulled and replaced to match Stalin's, distinctive gaps and gold fillings. In at least 3 cases, the doubles received transplanted skin from cadavers to replicate Stalin's pockmarked complexion scars from childhood smallpox that couldn't be adequately faked with makeup. The psychological preparation was worse than the physical. The doubles were imprisoned with recordings of Stalin's voice playing continuously, never allowed sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. They were beaten when they failed to replicate Stalin's Georgian accent precisely. They were shown photographs of Stalin's childhood home, his seminary, his first wife, until the doubles could navigate Stalin's memories as if they were their own. One double, according to later testimony, went mad and began insisting he was the real Stalin, that the Georgian in the Kremlin was the imposter. He was kept alive in a cell beneath Lubyanka for 7 years, alternately tortured and consulted as a living reference library whenever handlers needed to verify some detail of Stalin's past. By the time Germany invaded Poland, Stalin's double program had expanded to 12 active men. Some were used for public appearances, others for security theatre, riding in official cars, standing in for Stalin at moments when assassination seemed likely. At least 2 were permanently stationed at Stalin's dachas, living his daily routines in case German intelligence was monitoring his habits. The official story ends there. The truth, perhaps, does not. Because there are reports unconfirmed, from sources who wouldn't survive to testify that Stalin began using his doubles for something else entirely, that he would send them to conduct meetings with generals he suspected of disloyalty, using their responses to the fake Stalin as a loyalty test. That at least 4 generals were executed based on what they said to men who weren't actually Stalin at all. That Stalin, in his deepest paranoia, had created a shadow cabinet of himself, 12 versions of his will, each one testing the loyalty of different factions. If true, it would mean the Soviet Union was being governed partly by echoes. That orders issued in Stalin's name might have come from men who'd been born with entirely different faces and names, who'd had their very identities surgically and psychologically erased. And if that was happening in Moscow, what was happening in Berlin? The knock on Jack Dawn's office door came at 11:30 post-meridium on December 3, 1939. Dawn, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's chief makeup artist, had been preparing to leave for the night. He'd spent 14 hours working on The Wizard of Oz, perfecting the Cowardly Lion's face, and he was exhausted. He almost didn't answer the door. The 2 men who entered weren't in the film business. They wore dark suits and showed credentials that identified them as military intelligence, though the specific agency was redacted behind black blocks. They set a leather portfolio on Dawn's desk and opened it without ceremony. Inside were photographs of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Benito Mussolini, and Emperor Hirohito. "Mr. Dawn," one of them said, "we need you to tell us how you would duplicate these faces." Dawn studied the photographs. His professional eye analyzed bone structure, skin texture, the way light caught each man's features. Hitler's distinctive mustache, Stalin's pockmarks, Mussolini's pronounced jaw. "For film?" he asked. "For reality." Dawn was quiet for a long moment. He'd done makeup for The Wizard of Oz, Frankenstein, dozens of pictures where he'd transformed actors into creatures and monsters. But those were for cameras, for controlled lighting, for audiences who accepted the illusion from a distance. What these men were asking was something else entirely. "How close would the subject need to get to observers?" he asked finally. "Handshake distance." "In what lighting conditions? Everything from stage lighting to daylight to candlelight dinners." Notebook and began sketching. His hand moved automatically, drawing facial contours, noting measurements, calculating angles. Years of experience in Hollywood's most demanding makeup department had taught him things about human faces that even plastic surgeons didn't know. "It's possible," he said slowly. We've developed new foam latex techniques for Oz that could work for prosthetics. They're lighter than previous materials, more realistic in movement, but you'd need subjects with similar underlying bone structure, and you'd need them to commit fully hours daily in makeup chair, probably some actual minor surgery for really convincing results. That can be arranged. May I ask why American intelligence needs to duplicate foreign leaders? The two men exchanged glances. The one who'd remained silent finally spoke. Mr. Dawn, do you believe these photographs show the real men? Dawn looked at the pictures again. Hitler at a rally, Stalin on a balcony. His professional eye, trained to spot makeup and prosthetics, suddenly saw what he'd missed before. Hitler's ears were slightly different in two photos supposedly taken months apart. Stalin's hairline had shifted in a way that didn't match natural balding. Mussolini's famous jaw seemed more pronounced in some pictures than others. These aren't all the same men, Dawn said quietly. No, Mr. Dawn, we don't believe they are. The Germans and Russians appear to have been running double programs since at least 37. The British just started one, and if we're going to win this war, we need to catch up quickly. They left the portfolio with him. Inside, beneath the photographs, were detailed specifications for what would become Project Mirage, the United States military's first systematic attempt to create body doubles of its own leaders and, potentially, enemy leaders for infiltration purposes. Dawn worked on the project in secret for 6 years. His techniques, developed on Hollywood sound stages, would be used to create doubles for Roosevelt, Eisenhower, and MacArthur. His foam latex formulas would be classified military secrets until 1953. But here's what troubles the historical record. Dawn's personal notes, discovered after his death, contained sketches labeled German reference materials, dated October 1939, 6 weeks before the official visit from military intelligence. The sketches showed Hitler's face deconstructed into components, with notations about how to alter an actor's features to match. The technical detail suggested Dawn hadn't been theorizing. He'd been working from examination of actual prosthetics, which raises a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. How did a Hollywood makeup artist have access to German double-program materials before the United States had officially begun its own program, unless someone had provided them to him? Unless American intelligence had known about the German doubles earlier than admitted? Unless the whole program had started not in December 39, but months or even years before? Dawn never explained the discrepancy. When asked directly in 1952, during a security clearance review, he claimed the dates in his notes must have been transcribed incorrectly. But his handwriting was meticulous. He never made dating errors in his other work. The official story is that World War II's double programs began in response to the Munich bombing, a hasty innovation born of security necessity. The evidence suggests something different, that the infrastructure was already in place, that Andreas Kroner and 17 other actors had been identified and recruited before Georg Elser ever planted his bomb, that the near miss in Munich wasn't the beginning of the double war. It was simply the moment when the shadow war stepped into the light, just enough for us to glimpse its outline before it disappeared again into history's dark corners. By New Year's Day, 1940, the programs were operational across 3 nations. German doubles trained in the Bavarian Alps, British doubles smoked Churchill's cigars in Hampshire, Soviet doubles screamed themselves awake from nightmares in the Lubyanka basement, and in Hollywood, Jack Dawn was mixing foam latex and studying photographs of faces that might not be real. The war had begun. The official war, the one in textbooks, with tanks and troops and clearly marked front lines. But another war was beginning too, fought with mirrors and masks, with men who'd forgotten their own faces, with questions of identity so profound they'd echo for 80 years. We know the dates. We know the locations. We know the names of some of the doubles, though most died anonymous and were buried in unmarked graves. What we don't know is simpler and more disturbing. In all the photographs from 1939 forward, in all the newsreels and official portraits and historic handshakes, how many of those faces were real? And if they weren't, who was really leading the world into the abyss? The records, as always, are incomplete. The truth, as always, remains in shadow. But the shadows are speaking, if you know how to listen. The first German bomb fell on London at 4:47 post-meridium on September 7, 1940. By nightfall, 430 civilians were dead. The Blitz had begun 57 consecutive nights of bombing that would kill more than 43,000 Londoners and destroy over 1 million homes. The city burned. The Thames reflected orange flames. And in the chaos, as families huddled in underground stations and rescue workers dug through rubble, a very different kind of operation began. 3 miles outside Winchester, in Hampshire, a convoy of unmarked trucks arrived at a manor house whose gates had been closed since August. The trucks carried no military markings. The drivers wore civilian clothes. They unloaded crates labelled as medical supplies and photography equipment, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the crates were too heavy for cameras and too carefully handled for ordinary medicine. Inside Willoughby Manor, the double school was expanding. The original 9 students had become 23. Norman Shelley now trained newcomers in the specific rhythm of Churchill's speech patterns, while recordings played continuously in the background, not just speeches, but casual conversations recorded secretly during cabinet meetings, dinners, private moments when the Prime Minister dropped his public persona. The students learned 2 Churchills, the voice of Britain that boomed over radio, and the quieter, more calculating man who emerged after the cigars were extinguished and the photographers had left. The distinction mattered more than anyone outside the programme understood. The public Churchill, their instructor explained, is a performance the Prime Minister himself maintains. You're not imitating a man. You're imitating a man imitating his own ideal. There's the real Churchill, the public Churchill, and the Churchill the public needs to believe in. Your job is to become the third one. This philosophical complexity troubled several students. 1. A former Shakespearean actor named David Walsh questioned whether what they were doing was fundamentally different from treason replacing Britain's leader with actors, making the nation's voice a ventriloquist's trick. Walsh disappeared from the programme in November 1940. His file, declassified in 2008, contained a single notation. Subject experienced crisis of conviction, transferred to North Africa operations. No record exists of Walsh serving in North Africa. No record exists of David Walsh at all after November 19, 1940. The other students learned to stop asking philosophical questions. The Blitz provided something invaluable to the double program: chaos. In a city under siege, where entire neighborhoods vanished overnight and record offices burned, tracking identities became nearly impossible. When a man disappeared from his home and family, there were 1,000 explanations. A direct hit, trapped in rubble, caught in the open during a raid and incinerated so completely no remains could be identified. London was losing hundreds of people nightly. A few dozen more, carefully selected, would never be missed. The recruitment expanded. British intelligence identified not just vocal mimics, but men with the right physical build for Churchill, 5 feet 6 inches, stocky, with the kind of face that could be made rounder with prosthetics and strategic weight gain. They found them in theatre companies, in music halls, occasionally in prisons where men with the right look were offered a choice between continued incarceration and service to the Crown. The service was never quite explained until after they'd agreed. By January 1941, the Willoughby Manor facility housed 47 students in various stages of transformation. The Manor's ballroom had been converted to a makeup laboratory, where Hollywood techniques, Jack Dawn's techniques, copied from classified specifications shared between American and British intelligence, were refined for European faces. Foam latex prosthetics could add jowls, build up cheekbones, reshape noses. Under the right conditions, in the right light, a skilled makeup artist could turn a 30-year-old actor into a convincing 65-year-old statesman, but the physical transformation was only the beginning. The psychological conditioning was where the program became something darker. Students spent 16 hours daily immersed in Churchill's world. They read everything he'd written, memorized his childhood stories, studied his relationships with his parents, his war service, his political defeats and victories. They learned his favorite foods, his drinking habits, his complex relationship with his wife, Clementine. They learned, in ways that would trouble later psychologists, to think like Churchill. Some students excelled at this. Norman Shelley found he could channel Churchill's verbal rhythms so perfectly that even close associates couldn't distinguish his voice from the original. But Shelley also began experiencing something the program doctors classified as identity drift. He would catch himself making decisions as Churchill might, thinking in Churchill's cadences even when alone, dreaming in Churchill's voice. "I'm becoming him," Shelley told the program psychiatrist in March 1941. "Or he's becoming me. I can't tell anymore which thoughts are mine and which are his." The psychiatrist noted this in Shelley's file, but recommended he continue training. Identity drift, the notation suggested, wasn't a bug in the program. It was a feature. Because the best doubles weren't actors playing a role, they were men who'd ceased to exist as themselves and had been rebuilt as shadows. In the Bavarian Alps, in a facility built into the mountainside near Berchtesgaden, the German program had evolved in parallel directions, but with characteristically different methodology. The Germans were more systematic, more brutal, more thorough. Where the British program relied on training and makeup, the Germans combined these with surgery. Swiss plastic surgeon Carl Jung, no relation to the famous psychologist, though he'd studied under the same professors in Zurich, had been recruited in late 1939 to oversee medical transformation of Hitler's doubles. Jung's techniques were crude by modern standards but revolutionary for 1940. He pioneered using cartilage grafts to reshape noses, modified ears by removing small sections of tissue, used primitive dermabrasion to create artificial skin damage, matching Hitler's acne scars. The procedures were performed without adequate anesthesia, partly due to wartime medicine shortages, partly because the Gestapo believed pain created stronger psychological bonding between double and subject. The theory was that men who'd suffered to look like Hitler would be more committed to the deception. The theory was wrong, but by the time the program administrators realized this, 23 men had already undergone irreversible surgical alteration. Andreas Kroner, the Austrian actor who'd died in November 1939, had been one of the first. His transformation took 4 months. Jung reshaped his nose twice, the first attempt producing results too symmetrical for Hitler's distinctive broken-looking profile. Kroner's natural dark blonde hair was dyed black, then treated with chemicals to match Hitler's texture. His teeth were filed down and recapped to replicate Hitler's dental work, but the physical transformation was secondary to what happened in the isolation chamber. The doubles were kept in windowless rooms for weeks at a time. Their only human contact with interrogators who spoke only in Hitler's voice demanded they respond as Hitler would, punished incorrect answers with food deprivation and sensory assault. They watched hundreds of hours of Hitler footage, studied until they could replicate not just his public gestures, but his private mannerisms, the way he held his hands behind his back, the specific angle of his head when listening, the subtle expressions that crossed his face when angry but maintaining public composure. The program created a manual 700 pages long, discovered in fragments after the war, documenting every observable aspect of Hitler's behavior. The manual included sections on his morning routine, including the specific order he dressed, and the exact method he tied his boots. His eating habits, noting he took precisely 3 minutes between courses and never finished the last bite of any dish. His walking pattern, which favored his right leg slightly due to an old injury, his handwriting quirks, including how he formed the letter A and crossed his ents. His responses to specific subjects, catalogued by topic with recommended dialogue trees. The manual was updated weekly, based on observation of the real Hitler. The doubles studied these updates religiously, incorporating new information into their performances like actors learning script revisions. But here's what troubles the historical record. Several entries in the manual, dating from January 1941, describe Hitler behaviors that no one should have been able to observe. One entry details Hitler's private prayers, including the specific wording he used when alone in his bedroom at night. Another describes his nightmares, cataloguing recurring dreams about drowning and being buried alive. A third section provides guidance on replicating Hitler's behavior during intimate moments with Eva Braun, including details so specific they could only have come from direct observation. Someone was watching Hitler in his most private moments. Someone was documenting behaviors the Führer showed to no one. Either the real Hitler was aware of and participating in this surveillance, or the surveillance was being conducted without his knowledge. Both possibilities are disturbing. The second is terrifying, because if Hitler didn't know he was being so thoroughly documented, who was ordering the surveillance, and what were they planning to do with doubles so perfectly trained they could fool even Hitler's intimates? The operational deployment of doubles began in spring 1941, and the results were immediately effective. In March, a Hitler double appeared at a rally in Munich while the real Hitler was meeting with Mussolini in Vienna. German intelligence intercepted British communications, revealing confusion about Hitler's location. British agents in both cities had reported confirmed sightings. The deception achieved exactly what it was designed for. It made tracking Hitler's movements impossible, which made planning any assassination attempt equally impossible. But the program's architects were already thinking beyond security. General Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, proposed in April 1941 that doubles be used not just as decoys, but as tactical deception. A Hitler double could appear at the Eastern Front, suggesting to Soviet intelligence that invasion plans were active, while the real Hitler attended to other matters. The double's presence would force Soviet resources to the wrong locations, create confusion in their intelligence assessments, make them second-guess their own observations. The proposal was approved, and on May 10, 1941, something strange happened on the Eastern Front. German reconnaissance reported that a figure matching Hitler's description had been observed visiting forward positions near Brest-Litovsk, well inside territory that would become the invasion staging area for Operation Barbarossa. The figure spent 4 hours touring fortifications, speaking with commanders, and was photographed by German military cameras for propaganda purposes. Soviet intelligence observed the same visit through long-range surveillance. But here's the anomaly. German military logs from that day place the real Hitler in Berlin, meeting with Japanese ambassador Hiroshi Oshima to discuss Pacific coordination. The meeting was confirmed by multiple sources, lasted 7 hours, and included a formal dinner that concluded at 11:30 post-meridiem. Brest-Litovsk was 700 miles from Berlin. The visit there occurred from 2 post-meridiem to 6 post-meridiem. Unless Hitler had mastered teleportation, at least one of these events was conducted by a double. The question is, which one? Was Hitler really in Berlin, using a double to deceive the Soviets about German invasion preparations? Or was Hitler actually at the front, using a double to maintain diplomatic appearances in Berlin? Or, and this is where the records become truly murky, were both appearances conducted by doubles, while the real Hitler was somewhere else entirely, doing something no historical record has ever documented? The British got their first operational success in July 1941, though success might be the wrong word for what happened. Churchill was scheduled to inspect bomb damage in Bristol, a visit designed to boost morale in a city that had suffered devastating raids. The trip required a full day's travel by train, plus security arrangements and the usual chaos of a prime minister appearing in public during wartime. Churchill was also scheduled to meet with Roosevelt's special envoy Harry Hopkins in London that same afternoon, a meeting crucial to negotiating American support. The solution was obvious: send a double to Bristol. Norman Shelley made the trip, accompanied by Churchill's usual security detail and travelling in the Prime Minister's personal railway car. He toured the damage, met with local officials, gave a brief speech that was photographed for newspapers. The deception was complete. Local officials later swore they'd met with Churchill. Newspaper accounts confirmed his presence. But 3 people noticed something wrong. A Bristol woman named Margaret Hewitt was photographing the rubble of her destroyed home when the Prime Minister's convoy passed. She snapped a picture of Churchill waving from his car. When the photo was developed, she noticed the Prime Minister's left hand was bandaged. Churchill had injured his hand in a minor accident weeks earlier and still wore wrappings. except Churchill's injury had been to his right hand, not his left. Hewitt mentioned this to her husband, who suggested she was misremembering which hand had been injured. She insisted she'd read about it specifically in the newspapers. They consulted the Times archives at the local library. Churchill's right hand had been injured. The photograph showed a bandaged left hand. Hewitt kept the photograph but never published it. Years later, when interviewed for a documentary about wartime Bristol, she mentioned the discrepancy. The interview was filmed but never aired. The production company claimed technical difficulties had corrupted the footage. The photograph itself disappeared from Hewitt's personal collection sometime in 1953. Two other Bristol residents reported similar oddities, Churchill's signature looking slightly different than examples they'd seen, his walking pace faster than expected for a man his age, but these observations were dismissed as the natural confusion of exciting circumstances. No one seriously questioned whether they'd met the real Prime Minister. The programme administrators learned a crucial lesson. People see what they expect to see. When the Prime Minister visits, they see the Prime Minister, even when small details don't quite align. The human brain fills in gaps, corrects inconsistencies, makes the evidence match the expectation. This cognitive bias would become the Doubles programme's greatest asset. Once people believed they were meeting Hitler or Churchill or Stalin, their own minds would do most of the work of maintaining the illusion. In Moscow, Stalin's program had evolved past security theatre into something approaching systematic paranoia made manifest. By mid-1941, Stalin employed 12 active doubles, but the program structure had changed. Rather than keeping doubles in reserve for specific operations, Stalin began using them continuously, creating what internal NKVD documents called Parallel Existence Protocol. At any given time, at least 3 Stalins were active in different locations. One would be at the Kremlin, conducting normal business. Another, at Stalin's dacha, maintaining the appearance of his usual routines. A third might be visiting military installations, attending opera performances, or conducting surprise inspections of factories. The 3, or sometimes 4 or 5 Stalins, operated simultaneously, each believing themselves to be performing a specific mission on behalf of the real Stalin. But here's what the NKVD files hint at. Sometimes the doubles weren't told they were doubles. Evidence suggests that at least 3 of Stalin's doubles had been psychologically conditioned to believe they were actually Stalin. Through a combination of drugs, hypnosis, and manufactured memories, these men genuinely thought they were the Soviet leader, conducting important business, while other aspects of myself handled parallel duties. The psychological term for this wouldn't be developed until the 1950s, dissociative identity disorder. But Stalin's NKVD had accidentally created something similar artificially, fracturing identity across multiple bodies. One double, identified in later records only as Subject 7, kept a private diary that was discovered after his death in 1947. The entries are disturbing. I remember the seminary in Tiflis, though I also remember never attending. I remember Kato dying, my first wife, though I also remember she never existed. I am Stalin. I am also not Stalin. Both things are true. Both things are false. I wake up in different rooms and don't know if I've forgotten moving or if different versions of me sleep in different places. The diary continues for 3 years, charting Subject 7's gradual psychological disintegration as he tried to reconcile being simultaneously real and fake, himself and someone else, alive and erased. He killed himself in 1947 by drinking wood alcohol. His last diary entry reads, "If I die, does Stalin die? If Stalin dies, do I die? We are one person. We are 12 people. We are no people. The dialectic has eaten itself." The NKVD classified the diary and conducted psychiatric evaluation of the other doubles. Their conclusion, preserved in files that remained sealed until 2016, was chilling. The program has succeeded too well. Several subjects can no longer distinguish between performance and reality. Recommend termination and replacement, but caution that termination may trigger identity crisis in remaining subjects who will realize they are expendable shadows. The recommendation was ignored. The doubles remained active. And throughout 1941, as Germany prepared to invade the Soviet Union, multiple Stalins continued their parallel existences, each one haunted by the question of whether they were real. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. The same day, unrelated but eerily coincidental, American intelligence completed the first assessment of global double program capabilities. The report, declassified in 1998, estimated that 47 active doubles operated across major powers, though the authors admitted this number was essentially a guess. The nature of deception programs, the report concluded, is that successful deception leaves no trace. We can only count the failures, the doubles who were exposed or whose operations became known through captured intelligence. For every double we've identified, there may be 10 others performing successfully enough that no evidence of their existence has surfaced. The report recommended immediate expansion of American capabilities. Project Mirage, Jack Dorn's Hollywood-based program, was given unlimited black-budget funding and moved to a classified facility in the Mojave Desert. But the report also included a troubling appendix written by the Office of Strategic Services, Psychological Warfare Division. The strategic implications of widespread double deployment extend beyond security and deception. If multiple governments are simultaneously using doubles, we must consider the possibility of compounding deception, doubles of doubles, misattribution of actions to the wrong principles, or situations where no one in a chain of command can be certain they're interacting with authentic authorities. More concerning is the second-order effect. If populations learn their leaders are frequently replaced by doubles, legitimacy of government itself may become questioned. The social contract depends on knowing who holds power. If power can be held by shadows, what becomes of democratic accountability? We recommend maintaining absolute secrecy not just about our own program, but about the existence of double programs generally. Public knowledge of this capability would be more destabilizing than most military defeats. The recommendation was accepted, and for the next 80 years, an unwritten agreement held between governments: never officially acknowledge the doubles, never declassify the full scope. Let the evidence leak slowly enough that it remains deniable, conspiracy rather than confirmed history, because the truth would be too destabilizing. The truth that between 1939 and 1945, no one could be entirely certain who was really running the war. As 1941 ended, the three major programs were fully operational. German doubles trained in the Alps, British doubles smoked cigars in Hampshire, Soviet doubles wrestled with questions of identity in Moscow's underground facilities. And in the Mojave Desert, American doubles were learning to become Roosevelt, practicing his cigarette holder technique and the specific head tilt he used when listening to advisors. 47 confirmed doubles, perhaps 100 more unconfirmed, and the war had barely begun. The shadows were multiplying, and in the dark, shadows become indistinguishable from the real. We know this much. By January 1, 1942, every major world leader had at least one double. Most had several. What we don't know is simpler and more haunting. When these leaders met at Casablanca, at Tehran, at Yalta, were they actually meeting each other? Or were they meeting carefully prepared shadows, conducting a war between ghosts? The photographs show handshakes and smiles, but photographs can be staged. The records show agreements and decisions, but records can be falsified. The history books show who won and lost. But if the winners and losers weren't who we thought they were, what did we actually win? What did we actually lose? The doubles were ready. The world was at war. And in the shadows, a different war was beginning, one where the weapons were faces and the battlefield was identity itself. The desert sun rose over El Alamein on October 23, 1942, illuminating what would become one of the war's decisive battles. But 200 miles behind the lines, in a carefully staged camp near Alexandria, another kind of operation was reaching its climax. Bernard Montgomery's double, an Australian actor named Myrick Clifton James, was preparing for the performance of his lifetime. James had been recruited in August after intelligence officers noticed his uncanny resemblance to Montgomery. the same lean face, the same sharp nose, the same penetrating eyes. More importantly, James had lost a finger on his right hand in the First World War, matching an injury Montgomery had sustained years earlier. The physical resemblance was extraordinary, but what made James truly valuable was something else. German intelligence knew what Montgomery looked like and, crucially, where he was supposed to be. Operation Bertram, the deception plan for El Alamein, required making Rommel believe the main attack would come from the south, while Montgomery actually struck from the north. The plan involved dummy tanks, fake radio traffic, and elaborate camouflage. But the centerpiece was simpler and more audacious. Make Rommel think Montgomery was somewhere he wasn't. For 3 weeks before the battle, James appeared at military installations across Palestine and Syria, far from the actual front. He inspected troops, met with commanders, was photographed for intelligence purposes by local civilians who everyone knew reported to Axis agents. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed his convoys. German intelligence intercepted radio communications referencing Montgomery's inspection tour. The deception worked flawlessly. Rommel allocated 2 panzer divisions to defend against an attack from positions Montgomery had visibly inspected, positions that would never be attacked. When the real assault came from the north, German forces were out of position, their reserves committed to the wrong sector. El Alamein was a turning point in the North African campaign, and it was won, at least partially, by a one-fingered Australian actor smoking Montgomery's cigarettes and practicing his clipped speaking style. But something else happened during Operation Bertram, something that wouldn't surface in declassified files until 2003. On October 18th, 5 days before the battle, James attended a planning meeting with British commanders in Cairo. The meeting was routine, reviewing logistics, confirming timing, coordinating with air support. James played Montgomery perfectly, asking the kinds of detailed questions the real Montgomery would ask, making the small, decisive gestures Montgomery was known for. Except according to Montgomery's personal diary, discovered in his papers after his death, the real Montgomery was also at a planning meeting in Cairo on October 18th, a different meeting, with different officers, at a location 3 miles from where James was performing. 2 Montgomerys, in the same city, on the same day, both conducting military business. The official explanation is that the diary entry was misdated. Montgomery was known for irregular record-keeping. The discrepancy means nothing. But 3 British officers who attended James's meeting later reported something odd. When asked about a specific tactical detail regarding the 8th Army's tank reserves, James had answered with precise numbers and locations. Information he shouldn't have known. Information that hadn't been in his briefing materials. When questioned about how he'd known this, James claimed he'd been told during an earlier briefing he couldn't recall clearly, but the information he'd provided was wrong. The tank numbers were inflated by 30%. The locations were off by several miles. It was exactly the kind of misinformation you'd want German intelligence to intercept. Which raises a question. Had James accidentally provided false information, or had he been deliberately fed misinformation to pass along, knowing German agents were in the room? And if he'd been deliberately fed misinformation, who had fed it to him? And how had they ensured he'd deliver it naturally, without knowing he was being used as a conduit for deception? The operation had layers within layers, doubles performing for audiences who might themselves be performing for other audiences. Truth and fiction so entangled that even the actors couldn't be certain which they were delivering. The Eastern Front in 1942 was where the double programs became weapons of psychological warfare on an unprecedented scale. At Stalingrad, as German and Soviet forces ground each other down in the most brutal urban combat of the war, soldiers on both sides began reporting something impossible. Stalin was visiting the front, not occasionally, not in carefully staged propaganda appearances. Constantly, multiple Soviet soldiers swore they saw Stalin personally delivering ammunition to forward positions. Others reported him manning an anti-aircraft gun during German bombing runs. At least 40 separate sightings were documented between September and December 1942, often with Stalin appearing in multiple locations simultaneously. German intelligence compiled these reports with professional skepticism but growing alarm. Their analysis, captured after the war, concluded, either Soviet soldiers are experiencing mass hallucination under combat stress, or the Soviets have deployed multiple Stalin doubles in combat zones as a morale operation. If the latter, the psychological effect cannot be overstated. Soldiers who believe their supreme leader shares their danger will fight with enhanced commitment. The German assessment was correct but incomplete. Stalin was using doubles at Stalingrad. At least 5 of them operated in the combat zone during the battle's crucial months. But they weren't just for morale. They were gathering intelligence that no conventional spy network could obtain. When soldiers spoke to Stalin or the man they believed was Stalin, they spoke truthfully. They reported real conditions, real shortages, real failures by their commanders. Because you don't lie to Stalin. You don't hide problems from Stalin. Stalin sees everything, knows everything, and will punish deception more harshly than failure. The doubles filed reports after each appearance. These reports, compiled from interviews with traumatized soldiers who thought they were confessing to their supreme leader, provided Stalin with unfiltered intelligence about actual conditions at the front. But here's where the operation becomes truly Byzantine. German intelligence knew about the Stalin doubles, and they began deploying their own doubles in response. Hitler doubles appeared at German positions around Stalingrad, conducting similar morale operations. German soldiers reported seeing the Führer in forward trenches, sharing their rations, personally awarding Iron Crosses under fire. Both sides were running parallel operations. Both sides knew the enemy was running operations. But neither side could stop, because the psychological value was too high and the intelligence gathered too valuable. The result was surreal. German and Soviet doubles sometimes operated within a mile of each other, both performing leadership for troops who had no idea they were being deceived, while actual leadership sat in distant headquarters, making decisions based on intelligence gathered by these shadows. And then, in November 1942, something unprecedented happened. A Soviet patrol captured a German officer near the Barricade factory. During interrogation, the officer claimed to have personally received orders from Hitler just 3 days earlier. The officer described Hitler's appearance in details that matched known Hitler characteristics, but with small discrepancies. The Soviet interrogators recognized the signs of a double program. The officer was offered a choice: execution as a spy or cooperation. He chose cooperation, and revealed something Soviet intelligence hadn't suspected. The Germans knew about Soviet doubles because German doubles had encountered Soviet doubles in no man's land between the lines. The German officer described an incident where a Hitler double, moving between German positions at night, had literally bumped into a Stalin double doing the same thing in the rubble-strewn wasteland between armies. Both shadows had frozen, staring at each other in the darkness. Both recognized what the other was not through any evidence, but through the simple logic that neither should have been there. They'd stared at each other for perhaps 30 seconds. Then both had turned and retreated to their respective lines, neither reporting the encounter to their handlers. Because what would they report? That the enemy was using exactly the same tactics? That the entire war had a shadow layer running parallel to the official conflict? That they, as shadows themselves, had recognized kinship with the enemy? The German officer claimed there was an informal code among doubles on both sides. If you encountered an enemy double, you let them pass. You didn't report them. You didn't compromise their operation, because compromising their operation would invite scrutiny of your own, and scrutiny meant exposure, and exposure meant termination. The doubles, across all armies, had formed an unspoken brotherhood. They were all fighting the same war, not the official war between nations, but the private war to maintain their own existence. Soviet intelligence filed this report with highest classification. They never confirmed whether the account was true, but they did note that several Soviet doubles had reported anomalous encounters that they'd been unable to explain clearly. Something was happening in the shadows. The doubles were developing their own culture, their own rules, their own allegiances that transcended the war they were supposedly supporting. In the Pacific Theater, The double programs took on different characteristics shaped by different cultural contexts. Emperor Hirohito presented unique challenges for duplication. Unlike Hitler or Stalin or Churchill, whose power derived from personality and political position, Hirohito was considered divine, a living god whose legitimacy came from bloodline and spiritual role rather than personal characteristics. Creating a double of a god required different considerations. The Japanese program, designated Project Divine Mirror, began in early 1942 after American submarines made it clear that traveling between Japanese home islands and occupied territories carried significant risk. Losing the Emperor to American torpedoes was unacceptable. But the Emperor's presence in occupied territories was crucial for maintaining legitimacy of Japanese control. The Japanese recruited 5 men from kabuki theater, actors trained in classical court deportment and formal gesture. But the transformation required more than theater training. These men had to become sacred, at least in appearance. The program's architects faced immediate cultural resistance. Many Japanese officials viewed the creation of false emperors as not just deception but spiritual pollution. Creating shadows of the divine was inherently blasphemous. The program proceeded anyway, justified by military necessity, but the cultural unease never dissipated. The doubles underwent training in court ritual that took months to master the specific angle of head bows, the precise movements of formal dress, the elaborate protocols governing every gesture and word. They learned to speak in the emperor's distinctive formal court Japanese, a dialect barely comprehensible to ordinary Japanese speakers. But the real challenge was spiritual. How do you train someone to act divine? The program's solution was disturbing. The doubles were essentially inducted into a form of living death. They were told they had ceased to exist as individuals and had become vessels for divine will. They underwent Shinto purification rituals that lasted days. They were kept in isolation, except for handlers who treated them with the deference due to actual emperors. Several doubles experienced psychological breaks. One, identified in post-war records as Subject 3, began insisting he actually was the emperor, that the man in Tokyo was an imposter. He attempted to issue orders to military commanders and had to be physically restrained. He was declared to have been purified beyond mortal constraint and quietly committed suicide with a tanto blade in a ceremony his handlers later described as disturbingly authentic. Whether they assisted in this suicide or whether he performed it voluntarily remains unclear. By mid-1942, 3 Hirohito doubles were operational. They appeared at military ceremonies in occupied Manchuria, blessed kamikaze pilots in the Philippines, conducted religious observations in Tokyo, while the real emperor worked in the imperial palace. And pilots reported something strange. Multiple kamikaze pilots, men who survived their suicide missions due to mechanical failures or other circumstances, were debriefed and mentioned receiving personal blessings from the emperor at their airfield. These blessings occurred at airfields hundreds of miles apart, sometimes on the same day. American intelligence, intercepting Japanese communications, noted this pattern. Their analysis concluded the Japanese were successfully deploying Hirohito doubles. But they also noted something else. The blessings seemed to matter. Kamikaze pilots who believed they'd been blessed by the actual emperor showed higher success rates in their suicide attacks. The faith that they were dying with divine approval translated into more committed final flights. Whether those pilots had received blessings from the real emperor or from an actor in a shrine couldn't be determined, but the effect was real. Faith in the blessing mattered more than authenticity of the blessing. The Americans, studying these patterns, reached an uncomfortable conclusion. In psychological warfare, truth might be less powerful than belief. A false blessing from a real god was less effective than a real blessing from a false god, as long as the faithful believed. This principle would shape American deception operations for the rest of the war. Roosevelt's double program, operating from the Mojave Desert facility, had become the most technically sophisticated by early 1943. Jack Dawn's team had perfected foam latex prosthetics that could survive close inspection under varying light conditions. But the real innovation came from an unexpected source: Walt Disney Studios. Disney had been contracted by the military for propaganda and training films. but a subsection of that contract, classified until 2012, involved developing animation techniques for something else. The Disney team created what they called reference animations, detailed animated sequences showing Roosevelt's facial movements, gesture patterns, and expression ranges from every possible angle. These animations, created frame by frame with obsessive attention to detail, served as training tools for Roosevelt doubles. A double could study how Roosevelt's face moved when he smiled, how his cheek muscles engaged, how his eyes crinkled, the exact timing of each component. They could slow down complex expressions and see how they built from neutral to full emotion. The technique was revolutionary, and it worked. By March 1943, the Roosevelt double program had produced 7 men who could pass for the president in most contexts. 3 specialized in public appearances, 2 in radio addresses, 1 in intimate meetings with foreign dignitaries, and 1 whose identity remains classified in medical emergencies. Because Roosevelt's health was deteriorating, the polio that had paralyzed him in 1921 was progressing. He suffered from hypertension, congestive heart failure, and chronic bronchitis. His doctors gave him 2 years to live, maybe 3. The last double, the medical double, existed for a specific contingency. If Roosevelt died, there needed to be a transition period before public announcement. The medical double could maintain appearances for days or even weeks, while the administration prepared for the political transition. This contingency was activated once, during the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. Roosevelt attended the conference with Churchill to plan Allied strategy for the coming year. The official record shows Roosevelt participating in all major meetings, appearing healthy and engaged, making crucial decisions about the cross-channel invasion and unconditional surrender policy. But Roosevelt's personal physician, Admiral Ross McIntyre, left notes discovered after his death that tell a different story. According to McIntyre, Roosevelt suffered a severe medical crisis on January 17, the 3rd day of the conference. His blood pressure spiked dangerously. He became disoriented and was confined to bed rest for 36 hours. During those 36 hours, conference meetings continued. Roosevelt attended planning sessions, gave speeches, was photographed with Churchill and military commanders. McIntyre's notes include a cryptic line: Subject 7 performed admirably under circumstances. No one suspected. Decisions attributed to him were based on prior briefings, though 2 were made independently based on his judgment. We did not reverse them, as they aligned with probable authentic decisions. Subject 7, a Roosevelt double, had attended the Casablanca Conference and made strategic decisions about World War II, while the real Roosevelt recovered from a medical crisis in his quarters. How many other decisions were made this way? How many times did doubles exceed their theatrical mandate and begin actually governing? The records don't say, but they hint at a disturbing possibility. By 1943, the line between doubles performing decisions and doubles making decisions had dissolved. Churchill's program had evolved into something approaching a systematic architecture by mid-1943. Norman Shelley had become the primary voice double, recording speeches that were broadcast as Churchill when the Prime Minister was unavailable. But the program had expanded beyond simple substitution. Intelligence services were now using Churchill doubles for active deception operations. One operation, declassified in fragments but never fully revealed, involved a Churchill double meeting with representatives from Vichy, France, suggesting British support for a French uprising against German occupation. The meeting was designed to be betrayed. British intelligence knew Vichy was compromised by German agents. The false Churchill made promises of military support that were never intended to be kept. The Germans, learning of these promises through their Vichy sources, allocated resources to counter an uprising that wasn't coming. The operation was successful, but it also revealed something troubling. The doubles were now being used not just to protect their principles, but to actively deceive allies and enemies alike. And the doubles themselves were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Several British doubles had formed relationships with women who believed they were having affairs with the Prime Minister. One woman became pregnant and attempted to blackmail what she thought was Churchill. British intelligence had to carefully extract her from the situation without revealing the double program's existence. The solution was brutal. The woman was informed that her claims were delusional, the result of a breakdown caused by wartime stress. She was institutionalized in a mental facility, where she remained until 1958. The child was adopted through classified channels. Whether the woman was actually delusional or was telling the truth about her relationship with a Churchill double was never definitively established. The records were sealed. The double in question, identified only as Subject 12, was rotated out of the program, and his subsequent fate is unknown. But 3 other women made similar claims in 1942 and 43. All were institutionalized. All had children who were adopted through channels that left no paper trail. Somewhere in Britain, now in their 80s, there may be people who are genetically unrelated to Winston Churchill, but who are the children of men surgically and psychologically altered to become Winston Churchill. What are they? Who are they? The children of shadows? The offspring of theatrical deceptions given flesh? The question has no comfortable answer. By the end of 1943, the double programs had reached their operational peak, estimated active doubles, between 90 and 120 globally. Every major leader had multiple shadows. Every crucial military operation incorporated deception elements. Every strategic decision had to account for the possibility that the enemy knew where the real leaders were, or thought they knew, or was being deliberately misled about knowing. The intelligence services had created a hall of mirrors, where nothing could be taken at face value, and every observation required layers of verification. But something else was happening, something the program architects hadn't anticipated. The doubles were talking to each other, not directly, not through official channels, but through the underground networks that always form in secret operations. A British double would be captured by German forces, interrogated, and let slip information about how British doubles were managed. A Soviet double would defect and describe the Stalin program in exchange for asylum. An American double would become disillusioned and write everything down in a diary never intended for official eyes. Information was leaking, not to the public operational security held at that level, but between the programs themselves. The people running doubles operations in different countries were learning from each other, comparing techniques, studying each other's successes and failures. A peculiar professional community was forming, the people who managed shadows, the handlers who controlled ghosts. They were developing expertise that transcended national allegiance, the expertise of creating and maintaining human deception. Some of them, according to fragmentary evidence, began meeting in neutral Switzerland, informal gatherings where German handlers and British handlers and Soviet handlers could compare notes, discuss common challenges, even warn each other about planned operations that might prove fatal to their respective doubles. It was absurd. A secret fellowship of shadow managers, meeting in Zurich coffee houses, protecting their doubles while their countries tried to kill each other. But it made a certain sense. These people had more in common with each other than with their own governments. They understood the strange ethics of their work, the moral complexity of creating human illusions, the psychological toll on both doubles and handlers. They were, in a sense, conducting their own private war parallel to the official war. A war not about territory or ideology, but about the more fundamental question of what happens to humanity when identity itself becomes weaponized. And they were losing that war, though they didn't know it yet. Because in 1944, the double programs would spiral into chaos that made 1943's complications look like simple deception. The shadows were about to become darker than anyone had imagined. The deception began in Dover on the morning of January 28, 1944. General George Patton strode through the streets of the coastal town with his characteristic swagger ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, 3-star insignia gleaming, boots polished to mirror brightness. He inspected the 1st United States Army Group, a massive force assembling for what appeared to be the main invasion of France. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed his movements. German agents in Dover's pubs noted his presence. Intelligence reports flowed to Berlin. Patton was commanding the invasion force. Therefore, the invasion would strike at Calais, the shortest distance across the Channel. The logic was perfect. Patton was America's most aggressive commander. He would naturally lead the primary assault. His presence in Dover indicated Allied intentions, except the man in Dover wasn't Patton, and the 1st United States Army Group, with its thousands of tanks, hundreds of landing craft, and endless supply depots, didn't exist. Operation Fortitude, the deception plan for D-Day, had reached its apex. The Patton in Dover was a double, chosen for his similar build, and practiced in Patton's distinctive mannerisms: the profane speech, the aggressive posture, the love of dramatic gesture. The army he commanded was rubber and plywood inflatable tanks, fake landing craft, phantom divisions that existed only on radio frequencies and in German intelligence assessments. The real Patton was in southern England, in disgrace, after slapping 2 soldiers he'd accused of cowardice, sidelined from command of the actual invasion that would strike Normandy, not Calais. But German intelligence didn't know about the slapping incidents. They saw Patton where they expected him to be, commanding what they expected him to command. Their own assumptions completed the deception. The Patton double performed for 6 months. He attended parties where German agents might observe him. He gave speeches that were carefully leaked through channels known to be compromised. He appeared at military installations across southeastern England, always visible, always performing the role of a general preparing for the war's largest amphibious assault. The performance was so convincing that when D-Day came on June 6th and the invasion struck Normandy instead of Calais, German High Command initially believed it was a diversion. They held back armoured reserves, waiting for the real invasion at Calais, the invasion Patton was obviously commanding. Those reserves never deployed. The delay contributed to Allied success in establishing the Normandy beachhead, and the delay existed because a double had been so convincing that German commanders trusted their observations more than the evidence of actual invasion. But here's what the historical record doesn't tell us clearly. When did the real Patton learn about his double? Official accounts suggest he knew from the beginning that he was briefed on Operation Fortitude and understood his role in the deception. But Patton's personal diary entries from January through May 1944 contain references that don't quite align with this narrative. On February 14th, Patton wrote, "Heard the strangest rumour today that I've been seen in Dover reviewing troops. I haven't been to Dover in months. Either my reputation travels before me, or someone is impersonating me badly. If the latter, I hope he does it well." On March 22nd, another report of my presence somewhere I wasn't. Beginning to think there's something systematic about this. If someone is using my name for deception operations, I suppose I should be flattered. Also concerned about whether they're making me look competent. On April 30th, Bradley mentioned casually that I had given a speech in Dover last week. I've given no speeches. He smiled oddly when I pointed this out. I'm starting to understand something is happening that no one wants to explain directly. The entries suggest Patton discovered his double gradually, through accumulating evidence, rather than through official briefing. Whether this was intentional, keeping even Patton deceived about the full scope of operations, or simply careful operational security, is unclear. But it raises a disturbing possibility. If Patton, a 3-star general, wasn't fully briefed on his own double, who else was kept uninformed? How many other leaders discovered their shadows only through rumour and accident? The July 20th plot against Hitler created the war's greatest double mystery, a confusion so profound that 80 years later, historians still cannot establish with certainty what actually happened. At 12:42 post-meridium on July 20th, 1944, a bomb exploded in the conference room at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg had placed a briefcase containing plastic explosives under the conference table, then left the building under pretense of making a phone call. The explosion killed 4 men instantly and wounded several others. Hitler survived. But the accounts of Hitler's survival don't agree with each other in ways that cannot be explained by the usual confusion of traumatic events. Witness statements, collected immediately after the explosion by Gestapo investigators, describe Hitler's injuries with bizarre inconsistencies. Captain Heinz Assmann, present at the conference, reported Hitler's left arm was severely damaged, possibly broken, and that the Führer's trousers were shredded by the blast. General Alfred Jodl stated that Hitler's right ear was bleeding profusely and that he seemed partially deaf on that side. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel swore Hitler had been thrown against the wall and struck his head, producing a visible contusion on his forehead. Yet photographs of Hitler taken later that afternoon show him greeting Mussolini at the Wolf's Lair train station, supposedly just hours after the assassination attempt, with no visible head injury, no bandaged arm, and full use of both arms as he shook Mussolini's hand. The standard explanation is that witnesses were traumatized and misremembered details. But these weren't civilian witnesses in shock. They were senior military officers trained in observation and detail. An alternative explanation emerges from documents captured by Soviet forces and declassified in 2007. Multiple Hitlers were at Wolf's Lair that day. According to these Soviet intelligence assessments derived from interrogation of captured German officers, the Wolf's Lair normally housed at least 2 Hitler doubles at any given time, serving as decoys in case of assassination attempts. The conference room bombing may have killed or wounded one double, while another remained uninjured. The photographs of Hitler greeting Mussolini may show a third Hitler, unblemished, performing the role of miraculous survivor. If this assessment is correct, it would explain the contradictory witness statements. Different witnesses saw different Hitlers, each with different injuries or no injuries at all. In the chaos after the explosion, with smoke and confusion and bodies being carried out, no one could be certain which Hitler they'd seen. But the implications extend further. If Hitler used a double at Wolf's Lair, who made the crucial decisions in the hours after the assassination attempt? The real Hitler? Or a double who'd been briefed on how to respond to such contingencies? Because the response to the July 20th plot was swift and brutal. Within 24 hours, Stauffenberg and several co-conspirators were executed. Within weeks, thousands of suspected participants were arrested. The purge eventually consumed 5,000 people, including 49 senior officers and 2 field marshals. Those decisions about who lived and died, were they made by Adolf Hitler, or by an actor playing Adolf Hitler, or by some committee using a Hitler double to issue orders that Hitler himself might have issued? The historical record cannot answer with certainty, and that uncertainty is itself revealing. By July 1944, the double programs had become so sophisticated and so integrated into command structures that even major historical events cannot be confidently attributed to authentic actors. Operation Greif, launched during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, took the double concept to its logical and horrifying conclusion. SS Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny, famous for rescuing Mussolini from mountain imprisonment in 1943, was ordered to recruit English-speaking German soldiers, dress them in American uniforms, and infiltrate behind Allied lines to create chaos. The operation's public face, the part that entered historical record, involved commandos cutting telephone lines, changing road signs, and spreading false information. Several dozen Germans were captured in American uniforms and executed as spies per Geneva Convention provisions. But captured German documents revealed a parallel operation that was never fully prosecuted at Nuremberg. Operation Greif included doubles. German intelligence had compiled dossiers on senior American commanders Eisenhower, Bradley, Hodges, including photographs, physical descriptions, and behavioral profiles. Skorzeny's unit included actors trained to impersonate these commanders, with the goal of infiltrating Allied headquarters and issuing false orders during the critical opening hours of the German offensive. The operation was partially successful. At least 3 instances are documented where German actors posing as American officers issued orders that were followed by genuine American units. On December 17th, a figure matching Colonel Bruce C. Clark's description ordered a tank destroyer battalion to redeploy away from Bastogne, leaving a crucial gap in defences. The real Colonel Clark was 60 miles away at the time. On December 19th, someone claiming to be a liaison from Eisenhower's headquarters ordered an ammunition depot moved to a new location. The depot was abandoned just hours before German advance reached its original position. Whether the order was legitimate security or enemy deception was never established. On December 21st, a lieutenant colonel claiming to be from Hodges's 1st Army headquarters, appeared at a field hospital and ordered it evacuated. The hospital moved, and German intelligence later referenced having foreknowledge of that hospital's location. But the truly disturbing element emerged from Skorzény's post-war interrogations. He claimed, though this was never corroborated, that Operation Greif had an even more ambitious component. Doubles of Roosevelt and Eisenhower were prepared to issue radio broadcasts announcing German victory, creating psychological shock that would paralyze Allied response. The broadcasts were recorded, Skorzeny stated, using German actors who'd studied voice recordings for months. The recordings were never used because German forces failed to capture any Allied radio stations during the offensive. But Skorzeny insisted the recordings existed, that the voices were convincing enough to fool most listeners for the crucial first hours when confusion would be most valuable. American intelligence searched for these recordings after the war. They found no evidence they ever existed, but they also found no evidence they didn't exist. The mystery remains unresolved. More troubling, captured German soldiers reported that their briefings for Operation Greif had included information about Allied double programs suggesting German intelligence knew Americans were using Roosevelt doubles and had planned to exploit that knowledge. One captured soldier, in a statement buried in archives until 2015, claimed, "We were told the Americans wouldn't know if the broadcasts were real or from their own doubles. They'd developed such sophisticated deception that they could no longer trust their own eyes and ears. We were going to use their doubt against them." Whether this was German propaganda designed to demoralize captured soldiers or actual intelligence about Allied double programs' vulnerabilities remains unknown. But the statement reveals something important. By late 1944, the existence of double programs had become an open secret within military intelligence communities. Everyone knew, no one admitted knowing, and the knowledge itself became a weapon, creating doubt, uncertainty, paralysis. The Eastern Front's double operations had descended into something approaching surreal theater by 1944. During the Warsaw Uprising, which began on August 1st and lasted 63 days, multiple contradictory orders were issued bearing Stalin's authority. Polish resistance fighters, Soviet forces, and German occupiers all intercepted communications showing Stalin giving fundamentally incompatible directions. One set of orders commanded Soviet forces to advance and support the Polish uprising, promising ammunition and air support. These orders were dated August 3rd. A second set instructed Soviet forces to halt their advance and allow the Germans to suppress the uprising, describing the Polish resistance as reactionary elements hostile to Soviet interests. These orders were dated August 4th. A third set acknowledged the uprising but ordered Soviet forces to secure strategic positions outside Warsaw rather than enter the city, effectively leaving the Poles unsupported. These orders were dated August 5th. All three sets of orders bore appropriate authentication codes. All appeared to originate from Stalin's headquarters. Soviet commanders, receiving contradictory orders, were forced to make independent decisions about which Stalin to obey. Most chose the third option, halt and observe, because it was the least committal. The result was that Polish resistance fought without Soviet support for 2 months before being crushed by German forces, with over 200,000 Polish civilians killed. Whether this outcome resulted from deliberate Soviet policy or from confusion created by multiple Stalin doubles issuing conflicting orders has been debated for 80 years. Soviet archives remain unclear, but the pattern of contradictory orders suggests at minimum a severe breakdown in command coherence. More disturbing, German intelligence intercepted Soviet internal communications, expressing confusion about which orders were authentic. One message, sent by a Soviet general to Moscow headquarters, read, "Request clarification. Our orders received August 4th authentic. Signature and codes correct, but content contradicts previous directives. Need confirmation from Stalin personally." The response, according to captured German intelligence files, all orders bearing appropriate authentication are to be considered authentic. Stalin confirms all directives. The response confirmed nothing, except that Moscow itself couldn't or wouldn't, specify which Stalin had issued which orders. The system had broken down. Command authority had fragmented across multiple Stalin doubles, and the Kremlin had apparently decided that maintaining the illusion of unified command was more important than clarifying which orders were real. Polish resistance fighters died in the chaos. Whether they died due to Soviet policy or due to Soviet doubles issuing unauthorized orders while the real Stalin was occupied elsewhere is a distinction that mattered philosophically, but not practically. The dead were equally dead either way. In the Pacific, the Japanese double program had evolved in an unexpected direction. Emperor Hirohito doubles were appearing with increasing frequency at kamikaze airfields, blessing pilots before their final flights. But reports from surviving Japanese officers suggest something stranger was happening. The doubles were being treated as spiritually equivalent to the real emperor. Shinto theology doesn't easily accommodate the concept of doubles or copies. The emperor's divinity derives from direct descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. A double, created artificially, should have no spiritual authority. But in practice, the distinction dissolved. If a kamikaze pilot believed he'd been blessed by the emperor, his soul was prepared for sacrifice. Whether the emperor was authentic or performed by a kabuki actor didn't affect the spiritual state of the pilot. This realization that the spiritual power of the blessing came from the pilot's faith rather than the emperor's authenticity created a theological crisis that was never officially resolved. Some Shinto priests argued the doubles were spiritually contaminated. Others suggested that the doubles, in performing the emperor's role, became vessels for divine will, and thus were functionally equivalent to the emperor for ceremonial purposes. The debate was cut short by Japan's surrender. But the question lingered. If a false god produces real faith, what distinguishes false from true? American intelligence, monitoring Japanese communications, noted this theological crisis with professional interest. The implications went beyond Japanese spirituality. If people couldn't distinguish authentic authority from performed authority, what happened to the concept of legitimate power? Roosevelt double issuing orders had the same practical effect as Roosevelt issuing orders if everyone believed the double was real. The double's authority derived not from constitutional position but from successful performance of constitutional position. This meant authority itself had become theatrical. Power was no longer about who you were, but about who people believed you were. One American intelligence analysis from October 1944 stated, "The double programs have revealed something profound about political power. Authority is not inherent but performed. The man who successfully performs authority possesses it, regardless of legal or constitutional legitimacy. This principle has destabilizing implications for post-war democratic governance." The analysis was classified top secret and remained so for 65 years, because the implications were indeed destabilizing. If power is performance, then democracy becomes theater. Elections choose actors, not leaders. Legitimacy becomes special effects, and the consent of the governed becomes audience approval of a show they don't realize is being performed. By Christmas 1944, the double programs had reached a strange equilibrium of mutual confusion. Every major power estimated enemy double capabilities, but couldn't verify their estimates. Everyone assumed everyone else was using doubles, but couldn't be certain who was real and who was performed. Intelligence operations became recursive, trying to deceive enemy doubles while protecting friendly doubles, while determining which enemy observations came from real leaders versus performed leaders. The hall of mirrors had become infinite. Every reflection showed another reflection. Truth had been replaced by layers of interpretation, each layer potentially false, and the doubles themselves had become lost in the confusion. Several British doubles reported experiencing what psychologists later termed dissociative fugue states periods, where they couldn't remember whether they were performing Churchill or actually being Churchill. Norman Shelley, the primary voice double, kept a private journal describing his psychological deterioration. "I spoke with Clementine today. She laughed at something I said, something Winston would say, but I didn't plan to say it. It simply emerged, natural as breathing. Was I performing Winston's humor, Or have I become someone who naturally speaks as Winston speaks? I can't tell anymore. My own voice sounds false. His voice sounds like mine. We've merged somewhere in my throat. American doubles reported similar experiences. One, Roosevelt, double identity still classified, submitted a medical report in November 44 describing increasing difficulty distinguishing between briefed memories and actual memories. I remember polio and recovery at Warm Springs, though I've never been to Georgia. I remember my wedding to Eleanor, though I've never met her. The memories feel authentic. I suspect I'm losing my original identity, though I can no longer clearly remember who that was. Soviet archives contain psychiatric evaluations of Stalin doubles, showing even more severe identity dissolution. One evaluation from December 44 reads, Subject 9 believes himself to be Stalin, not performing as Stalin believes identity is Stalin. When shown photographs of himself before surgical alteration, he identifies the man in photos as some Georgian peasant and expresses confusion about why we're showing him pictures of strangers. Subject 9 has ceased to exist. Only Stalin remains, though this Stalin is false. Recommend termination, though unsure what this means when the subject has no identity to terminate. The doubles were disappearing into their performances, and no one in command seemed concerned about this. The better the double, the less they needed to exist as themselves. But something else was happening that would only surface after the war. The doubles were meeting in secret. In neutral Switzerland, in Istanbul, in Stockholm, doubles from different nations had begun making contact with each other, not through official channels, not with handler knowledge, through their own initiative, driven by the desperate need to find someone else who understood what was happening to them. These meetings, verified through post-war testimony and fragmentary documents, created an underground international community of shadows, men who'd stopped being themselves, who'd become theatrical versions of powerful men, who shared the unique experience of having their identities erased for military necessity. They traded survival strategies. They warned each other about operations that might prove fatal. They discussed the philosophy of their existence, what it meant to be someone else, whether identity could be recovered, whether they wanted to recover it. One report, from a British double who defected to Switzerland in 1946, described a meeting in Stockholm in December 44, where a Churchill double, a Stalin double, and a Hitler double sat in a cafe together, drinking coffee and discussing their shared condition. The scene was surreal. Three enemies, except they weren't enemies because they weren't actually Churchill, Stalin, and Hitler. They were actors performing those roles, and in that moment they dropped the performance and reverted to what? Not their original selves, which no longer existed, to the state of being doubles, which was itself a kind of identity. The British double reported that the Hitler double was the most psychologically damaged. He'd undergone extensive surgery and hormone treatment. He could no longer remember his original name. He spoke only in Hitler's Austrian-accented German. He moved only in Hitler's distinctive mannerisms. He'd become Hitler so completely that no trace of his original self remained. He asked us, the British double reported, if we thought Hitler would miss him as when the war ended. He wanted to know if the real Hitler had any idea how thoroughly his doubles had sacrificed themselves. We had no answer. We didn't know if our own principals knew or cared. The meeting broke up before midnight. Each double returned to his respective handlers. The war continued. The performances continued. But for a few hours in Stockholm, the masks had come off. And beneath the masks was not the original faces, but emptiness, the void where identity used to be. As 1944 ended, Allied intelligence estimated over 120 active doubles operated globally. The actual number was likely higher. Many doubles were so successful they left no trace in the historical record. The programs had achieved their objectives: protecting leaders, deceiving enemies, maintaining morale, enabling strategic deception. The success was unprecedented, but the cost was becoming clear. The doubles were losing themselves. The handlers were losing track of who was real. The intelligence services were drowning in mirrors, and the war was entering its final phase, where the chaos would multiply exponentially and the line between reality and performance would vanish entirely. The shadows had grown so deep that even the people casting them could no longer see clearly. The Führer bunker in Berlin, spring of 1945, had become a tomb where the living and the dead walked together indistinguishably. Soviet artillery pounded the streets above. The Third Reich was collapsing inward, compressed into a few square miles of rubble and burning buildings. And in the concrete chambers beneath the Reich Chancellery, witnesses began reporting something impossible. Hitler's eyes changed color, not gradually, as eyes sometimes appear different in varying light. Suddenly, completely, Lieutenant Colonel Nikolaus von Below, Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, noted in his diary entry for April 15, 1945. The Führer's eyes were distinctly brown, and this morning during briefing. By evening session, they appeared blue-grey. I mentioned this to Bormann, who suggested the lighting was poor, but I've served the Führer for years. I know his eyes. Rochus Misch, the telephone operator who spent more time in Hitler's presence than almost anyone during those final weeks, reported something similar in his post-war testimony. Sometimes the Führer was taller than me by perhaps 2 inches. Other times we were nearly the same height. I thought I was going mad. The bunker did that to people, the constant shelling, the lack of sleep, the knowledge that we were all going to die. But others noticed it too. We just didn't speak of it. The physical inconsistencies multiplied. Hitler's famous mustache appeared fuller some days, trimmer others. His posture changed, sometimes the bent, trembling figure of a man aged beyond his 56 years, other times straighter, more vigorous. His left arm tremor, a symptom of Parkinson's disease that had become pronounced by 1945, would be severe during morning conferences, but barely noticeable by evening. The official explanation, provided by Hitler's personal physician Dr. Theodor Morell, was that medications produced varying effects throughout the day. Morell was administering dozens of drugs to Hitler: amphetamines, barbiturates, opiates, experimental compounds. But Morell's medical logs, captured by American forces and declassified in 1991, show something strange. On at least 7 occasions in April 1945, Morell recorded treating the Führer for the same condition twice in the same day, administering identical injections at times when, according to other records, Hitler was in meetings or sleeping, unless Morell was treating 2 different Hitlers. Unless multiple versions of the Führer were cycling through the bunker, each requiring their own medical maintenance. Eva Braun's testimony, preserved through her sister Gretel Braun and several others who survived, adds another layer of confusion. In the final days, Eva allegedly told Gretel, "I don't know anymore if I'm marrying the man I fell in love with, or one of his shadows. Does it matter? We're all shadows now." On April 29, 1945, Hitler married Eva Braun in the bunker. The ceremony was witnessed by Bormann and Goebbels. Photographs were not taken, or if taken, never surfaced. The following day, April 30th, the newlyweds committed suicide in Hitler's study. Their bodies were carried outside, doused with gasoline, and burned in the Reich Chancellery garden while Soviet shells fell nearby. But the bodies were never properly identified. Soviet forces recovered remains from the garden, but the forensic evidence was contradictory. Dental records appeared to match Hitler's known dental work, except the skull fragment that supposedly belonged to Hitler was later DNA tested and found to be from a woman between 20 and 40 years old. The standard explanation is that the remains were mixed up in the chaos of Berlin's fall, that multiple bodies burned in the garden became confused. But another possibility has haunted historians for 80 years. The man who married Eva Braun was a double. The man who died on April 30th was a double. Perhaps multiple doubles died in the bunker, their bodies burned together, creating the forensic confusion that has never been resolved. If this is true, where was the real Hitler? Did he die earlier, perhaps weeks before the official suicide, with doubles maintaining the performance until the final collapse? Did he escape, leaving a double to die in his place? A theory that has spawned endless speculation despite lack of credible evidence. Or was he simply not there at all during the final days, commanding from a remote location while doubles played out the tragic finale? The historical record cannot answer with certainty, and perhaps that's exactly what the double program was designed to achieve, not just protecting Hitler's life, but ensuring that even his death could never be confirmed beyond doubt. The execution of Benito Mussolini on April 28, 1945, created similar mysteries that have never been satisfactorily resolved. Mussolini fled north from Rome as Allied forces advanced, attempting to reach Switzerland and exile. On April 27, Communist partisans stopped a German convoy near the village of Dongo. Mussolini was discovered hiding in the back of a truck, wearing a German greatcoat and helmet as a disguise. The partisans took him to a farmhouse, held him overnight, and executed him the following afternoon. His mistress, Clara Petacci, was shot alongside him. Their bodies were transported to Milan and hung upside down from a service station roof in the Piazzale Loreto, where Mussolini had previously displayed the bodies of executed partisans. Crowds gathered to view and deface the corpses. The official account is straightforward. Mussolini tried to escape, was captured, and was executed by the resistance. Justice was served. The dictator met an appropriate end. But forensic examination of the body raised immediate questions. Mussolini's personal dentist, Dr. Aldo Cerroni, was brought to examine the corpse hanging in Piazzale Loreto. His report, suppressed for years but eventually published, noted significant discrepancies. The dental work didn't match his records for Mussolini. Several teeth that should have had gold fillings showed only standard amalgam. The bite alignment was different. Cerroni initially refused to confirm the body was Mussolini. He was pressured by partisan leaders. Confirmation was politically necessary. He eventually signed a statement identifying the body but added a handwritten notation. Identification made under circumstances preventing thorough examination. Physical measurements also raised questions. The body's height was recorded as 5 feet 6.5 inches. Previous medical records listed Mussolini as 5 feet 8 inches. The 2-inch discrepancy is larger than can be explained by post-mortem changes or measurement error. And Clara Petacci allegedly screamed something before her execution. Witnesses reported her shouting varied phrases. Some said she screamed, "No, not him. You're killing the wrong man." Others reported she simply begged for mercy. The partisan who killed her, Walter Odizio, insisted she said nothing at all. The story Odizio couldn't account for was why he shot Petacci when she wasn't on the execution list. Petacci was Mussolini's mistress but had committed no war crimes. Odizio's explanation was that she threw herself in front of Mussolini at the crucial moment, that killing her was accidental collateral damage. But another interpretation has persisted. Petacci was killed because she recognized that the man being executed wasn't actually Mussolini, and her testimony would have compromised the political necessity of Mussolini's confirmed death. If the body wasn't Mussolini, where was the real Il Duce? One theory, supported by fragmentary evidence but never proven, suggests Mussolini had been killed weeks earlier during his flight north, possibly by German allies who had decided he was a liability. The man captured at Dongo was a double, maintained for exactly this contingency if capture seemed inevitable. The double would be sacrificed to satisfy the partisans' desire for justice, while the real Mussolini's fate remained unknown. Spanish newspapers in early 1946 reported sightings of Mussolini in Argentina. These reports were dismissed as conspiracy theories, but the Argentine government never fully cooperated with Italian investigators looking into the matter, and certain Argentine immigration records from that period remain classified. The mystery deepens with a single photograph. In 1973, an Italian magazine published a photo allegedly taken in Buenos Aires in 1947, showing an elderly man with a shaved head, bearing remarkable resemblance to Mussolini. The man's identity was never confirmed. The photograph's authenticity was never established. But forensic analysis suggested the facial bone structure was consistent with Mussolini's known features. Was the body in Piazzale Loreto genuine? Was Mussolini executed at Dongo? Or did a double die in his place while the real dictator disappeared into the shadows of post-war chaos? The official answer is that Mussolini died on April 28, 1945. The evidence suggests the answer might be more complicated, and that complication serves a purpose: maintaining uncertainty, preventing closure, ensuring that even in death, Mussolini's doubles continued their work of deception. The liberation of concentration camps in early 1945 revealed a dimension of the double programs so horrifying it was actively suppressed by Allied authorities. At Majdanek, liberated by Soviet forces in July 1944, and later at Auschwitz in January 1945, investigators found something unexpected among the documentation of systematic murder: evidence of elaborate duplicate person programs. The Nazis had been creating doubles of prominent Jewish prisoners. The purpose was propaganda. The Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, under Goebbels' direction, had filmed elaborate productions showing Jewish criminals confessing to various alleged crimes against Germany. These films were shown domestically and internationally to justify the final solution, but many of the Jews in these films had already been killed. The solution was to create doubles prisoners who resembled the deceased, who were given scripts and forced to perform confessions while being filmed. At least 47 such propaganda doubles have been documented, though the actual number was likely far higher. The doubles were selected from incoming transports, chosen for physical resemblance to already deceased prisoners, whose names carried propaganda value. The most disturbing case involved Mordecai Anielewicz, leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, who died fighting in May 1943. Between 1943 and 45, at least 4 different propaganda films were produced showing Anielewicz confessing to terrorism, collaboration with the Soviet Union, and various other crimes. 4 different films, 4 different actors forced to portray Anielewicz. Each one was executed after filming concluded, then replaced by another double for the next production. The films themselves were largely destroyed, but fragments survived in captured German archives. Forensic comparison of the surviving footage confirms these were different men. Facial measurements don't match, voices are different, even the body language varies between films. The Nazis had created an assembly line of Jewish doubles, each one performing their assigned role before being murdered and replaced. The doubles weren't meant to deceive closely. The films were propaganda for audiences who'd never met the real people being portrayed. The doubles just needed to be convincing enough for cameras, believable enough for viewers predisposed to accept the narratives being presented. This revelation created an ethical crisis for post-war documentation efforts. How do you record the Holocaust when some of the evidence is deliberately falsified? When some of the survivors whose testimony was filmed were actually doubles forced to recant real survivors' stories? When the documentary record was corrupted by performance and deception at its source? The solution was silence. Allied authorities classified most information about the propaganda double programs. References were removed from official Holocaust documentation. The emphasis was placed on establishing clear, verifiable truth, not on exploring the ways truth had been deliberately poisoned by deception. But the silence created its own problems. Holocaust deniers later seized on minor inconsistencies in survivor testimony, inconsistencies that sometimes arose because testimony was given by doubles rather than actual survivors, or because real survivors' memories were confused by having seen propaganda films featuring doubles of themselves or people they knew. The truth was too complex, too painful, too easily weaponized. So it was buried, becoming another shadow in a war increasingly defined by shadows. Franklin Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945, triggered the most dangerous constitutional crisis in American history, one that remained classified for 60 years. The official account states Roosevelt suffered a cerebral hemorrhage at his cottage in Warm Springs, Georgia, at 1:15 post-meridium. He lost consciousness immediately and died at 3:35 post-meridium. Vice President Harry Truman was informed at 7 to 9 post-meridium and took the oath of office that evening, becoming the 33rd President of the United States. The transition was smooth. The constitutional process functioned as designed. Democracy survived its test. But declassified Secret Service logs reveal something strange. Between 3:35 post-meridium, when Roosevelt was officially pronounced dead, and 10:45 post-meridium, When Truman's oath of office was publicly announced, Roosevelt appeared at 3 different locations. At 5:20 post-meridium, Roosevelt was observed by White House staff in the Oval Office, reviewing documents. The staff member, a secretary named Dorothy Brady, filed a report noting she'd delivered papers to the president and had received his signature on 2 executive orders. At 6:40 post-meridium, Roosevelt was seen by reporters in the White House press room, though he didn't speak to them directly. The reporters noted his presence in their logs but didn't question why the president was visible when no announcement about his activities had been made. At 8:15 post-meridium, Roosevelt appeared briefly at a military planning session at the Pentagon, according to the log kept by Army Chief of Staff George Marshall. Marshall's notation reads, "Brief appearance by FDR, looking unwell. Meeting continued with JCS staff." 3 sightings of a dead president scattered across 6 hours, while the government worked frantically to manage the transition of power. The conventional explanation, offered decades later when these discrepancies finally surfaced, was mistaken identity and confused timekeeping under stressful circumstances. People saw what they expected to see. Memories were unreliable. The chaos of the moment produced errors in documentation, but one Secret Service agent, in a deathbed confession recorded in 2001, told a different story. There was a medical double. Roosevelt's health had been declining for years. We'd prepared for sudden death because doctors said it was likely. The double's job was to maintain appearances during the transition period, buy time for the administration to prepare announcements, brief Truman, manage the shock. When FDR died in Warm Springs, the double was activated. He appeared in Washington to maintain the illusion of continuity, while the actual transition happened out of public view. He performed for 6 hours, signing documents that had already been prepared, making brief appearances where he'd be seen but not engaged directly. The double was good. He'd been practicing for 3 years. But he had a problem: he didn't know Roosevelt was actually dead. His handlers told him this was a security drill. He thought he was covering for Roosevelt during a medical emergency, not impersonating a dead president. When he learned the truth, after Truman's oath of office, he had a breakdown. Complete psychological collapse. He was institutionalized under a false identity and spent the rest of his life in a VA psychiatric hospital. His real name is still classified. He died in 1971, still believing he'd committed some crime by impersonating the president, never understanding he'd been following orders. If this account is accurate, and the agent provided details that matched classified records, then the United States government continued to operate under a dead president's authority for 6 hours. Documents were signed in a dead man's name. Orders were issued by a dead man's double. The constitutional legitimacy of those 6 hours rests on whether an actor following orders can legitimately wield presidential power. The question was never adjudicated because the events were never officially acknowledged. The documents signed during those 6 hours remained valid. The orders issued were carried out, and the legal fiction that Roosevelt lived until Truman's oath of office was maintained in all official records. Truth was sacrificed to preserve legitimacy, and perhaps that was the correct decision. Perhaps admitting that presidential authority had been wielded by a theatrical performance would have damaged faith in government more than maintaining the noble lie. But it raises the uncomfortable question: if a double can successfully perform presidential power for 6 hours, what prevents performing it for 6 days? 6 months? 6 years? Where is the line between performance and reality when performance has real-world effects and reality is unknowable? The race for Berlin in April and early May 1945 became a hunt for doubles as much as a pursuit of victory. Soviet forces pushing into Germany had specific orders regarding Hitler. Capture him alive if possible, but at minimum confirm his death and recover his body. Stalin wanted proof. He didn't trust German announcements. He didn't trust American intelligence. He wanted Hitler's corpse on a slab in Moscow. What Soviet forces found instead was confusion. On May 2nd, Soviet troops searching the Reich Chancellery Garden discovered bodies burned beyond easy recognition. The remains were transported to Soviet intelligence for examination. Forensic analysis suggested one body matched Hitler's height and dental work. On May 4th, a second body was discovered in the Führer bunker itself, hidden in a ventilation shaft. This body also appeared to match Hitler's general physical description, though it was less thoroughly burned and showed signs of different cause of death: gunshot versus cyanide poisoning. On May 9th, a third Hitler body was reported by Soviet soldiers clearing rubble near the Brandenburg Gate. This body had been crushed under collapsed masonry and was identified through uniform remnants and personal effects. 3 Hitler bodies, all with some claim to authenticity, none perfectly matching known records. Stalin's response was characteristically paranoid. He declared publicly that Hitler had escaped, that the bodies were obviously doubles, that the British or Americans were hiding Hitler to use him against the Soviet Union. Soviet intelligence spent years following false leads and conspiracy theories, searching for a Hitler who might not have existed. But an alternative interpretation suggests Stalin's paranoia might have been justified, though for different reasons. He recognized the bodies as doubles because he understood the double program intimately from his own experience. He knew that sophisticated operations would have prepared multiple doubles for exactly this contingency. Stalin's question wasn't, "Is this Hitler?" It was, "Which of Hitler's multiple prepared death doubles are we finding, and where is the real body or the real man?" The answer may be that the real Hitler did die on April 30th as officially recorded, but the Nazis had prepared so many doubles, with so many prepared suicide scenarios, that recovering the authentic body became impossible. The double's purpose wasn't to save Hitler, it was to ensure that even his death would be shrouded in uncertainty. Mission accomplished. 80 years later, conspiracy theories still flourish about Hitler's survival, theories enabled by the very real existence of Hitler doubles and the very real confusion about which body or bodies were recovered from the bunker. The suicide epidemic among doubles in the war's final months has never been adequately explained or even acknowledged in official histories. Between April and June 1945, at least 17 confirmed doubles took their own lives. The actual number was likely higher, as many doubles' identities were classified and their deaths recorded under false names or not recorded at all. The suicides shared common patterns. Most occurred after their principals died or were captured, when the doubles' performances were no longer needed. Many left notes expressing identity confusion, inability to return to their original selves, or a sense of having been erased so thoroughly that suicide seemed like the only authentic choice remaining. One British Churchill double, identified only as Subject 19 in declassified files, hanged himself in May 45. His note read, "I've been Winston Churchill for 5 years. I've given his speeches, smoked his cigars, fooled his enemies and allies. Now the war is ending, and someone expects me to be whoever I was before. But I don't remember who that was. I only know how to be Churchill. If I can't be Churchill, I can't be anyone. Better to be no one than to fail at being myself." An American Roosevelt double identity still classified attempted suicide in June 45 but survived. His psychiatric evaluation, declassified in 2009, noted, "Subject expresses belief that he died with Roosevelt in April, claims that the person who survived Roosevelt's death is not him, but a shadow of a shadow, a copy of a copy, that was never real to begin with. Subject questions whether he ever existed at all, or if he was always just a theatrical premise." Soviet archives contain at least 8 double suicide reports from May through July 45. One Stalin double left a note in Georgian Stalin's native language, which the double had learned during his transformation, that read, "I killed Stalin by becoming him. Now I must kill myself to complete the murder." The philosophical weight of these suicides was immense. These men had been psychologically destroyed by their service, their identities erased not by enemy action but by their own government's systematic conditioning. They were casualties of a different kind of warfare, one that targeted identity itself, but their suicides created operational problems. Each death risked exposure of the double programs. Each note risked documentation of practices that governments wanted to remain secret. The solution was to classify the suicides, change cause of death in official records, and in some cases make the doubles disappear entirely from documentation. Men who'd already stopped existing as themselves were erased from history completely. They became shadows of shadows, performances that left no trace, identities that never were. The only evidence they existed at all is in classified files, partially redacted notes, and the occasional reference in other documents that escapes notice during declassification review. They served their nations by ceasing to exist, and their nations thanked them by ensuring they never existed in historical memory. As the war ended in Europe on May 8th and in the Pacific on August 15th, 1945, the double programs didn't end, they went underground. The Cold War was already beginning before the Hot War concluded, and every lesson learned about doubles, deception, and identity warfare was carried forward into the new conflict. Some doubles were retired, given new identities, relocated, provided small pensions, in exchange for lifelong silence. But others remained active, their skills too valuable to waste. And in the chaos of victory, as millions of displaced persons moved across Europe, as occupation zones were established and intelligence services competed for advantage, the doubles melted into the confusion. How many former Hitler doubles ended up in Argentina or Paraguay, living under assumed names, occasionally recognized by those who'd known the doubles rather than the real Hitler? How many Stalin doubles remained active in Soviet service, their existence never officially acknowledged, their operations never recorded? How many Churchill or Roosevelt doubles continued working for British or American intelligence, deploying their practiced identities for new purposes? The records don't tell us. Perhaps they never will. What we know is that the infrastructure built for double programs, the makeup techniques, the psychological conditioning, the surgical procedures, the training methods, all of it was preserved and refined for future use. The war ended. The doubles didn't. They simply found new roles, new performances, new faces to wear. And somewhere in the ruins of Europe and the rebuilding of Asia, men who'd forgotten who they were continued walking through history, leaving shadows that would never entirely disappear. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg opened on November 20th, 1945. In the Palace of Justice, a building chosen partly because it had survived the Allied bombing relatively intact, and partly because it contained a large prison capable of holding the defendants. 24 Nazi leaders were indicted. 21 actually stood trial. And from the beginning, something was wrong. Hermann Göring, once the Second Reich's most powerful figure after Hitler, appeared on the opening day looking gaunt and clear-eyed, having been detoxified from his morphine addiction during captivity. But over the course of the trial, witnesses noted strange fluctuations. Some days Göring appeared sharp, defiant, intellectually engaged. Other days he seemed confused, lethargic, barely following proceedings. His weight fluctuated dramatically. Prison records show Göring weighed 193 pounds at intake in May 1945. By August, he'd dropped to 168 pounds. By November, he'd gained back to 181 pounds. By February 1946, he was down to 153 pounds, a 40-pound swing in 9 months, while imprisoned with controlled diet and no access to drugs that might explain the variation. Göring's own lawyer, Otto Starmer, expressed private doubts documented in letters discovered decades later. In a note to his wife dated January 15, 1946, Starmer wrote, "I spoke with my client today and could have sworn I was speaking to a different man than yesterday. His mannerisms were different. His voice was different. Even his eyes seemed different color in the light. I mentioned this to the American guards, who suggested the prison lighting creates optical illusions. But I've practiced law for 30 years. I know my client's face." The Rudolf Hess case was even more troubling. Hess, Hitler's former deputy who'd flown to Scotland in 1941 in a bizarre solo peace mission, had been held by the British throughout the war. When transferred to Nuremberg for trial, multiple observers noted he seemed like a completely different person from the man who'd been imprisoned in Britain. Hess claimed to have amnesia. He couldn't remember his family, his role in the Nazi Party, or much of his past. Psychiatric evaluation suggested the memory loss was genuine, though its cause remained unclear. Possible head trauma from his plane crash in Scotland, psychological breakdown from isolation, or something else. But here's what troubles the record. British intelligence officers who'd interrogated Hess between 1941 and 45 insisted the man at Nuremberg wasn't the same person they'd questioned in British custody. Major James Douglas Hamilton, who'd interviewed Hess extensively, stated in 1979, "The man at Nuremberg had different physical characteristics. His ears were shaped differently. His eyes were a different color. His voice was similar but not identical. I raised these concerns with my superiors and was told I was mistaken, that years of imprisonment had changed his appearance. But ears don't change shape. Eye color doesn't change." The official explanation was that Douglas Hamilton had misremembered details, that the stress of war had affected his perception, that his concerns were unfounded. But Hess's wife Ilse also claimed the man at Nuremberg wasn't her husband. She visited him in prison and afterward told family members, "That man is not Wolf, her pet name for Rudolph. His expressions are wrong. His hands move differently. Someone has replaced my husband." Her claims were dismissed as the delusions of a woman unable to accept her husband's transformation under stress of imprisonment and trial. Hess was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment at Spandau Prison in Berlin. He remained there for 46 years, becoming eventually the prison's sole inmate as other sentences were completed. He died in 1987 at age 93, officially by suicide, though the circumstances were suspicious enough that his family challenged the verdict. But the deeper question was never officially addressed. Was the man imprisoned at Spandau for 46 years actually Rudolf Hess? Or was he a double, installed during the war years, who spent half a century performing a role that had become his only identity? If the latter, where was the real Hess, dead since 1941, perhaps killed in a British interrogation that went wrong, with a double installed to cover the diplomatic disaster? Alive somewhere, under a new identity, while a double took his place in the dock? The evidence is contradictory. The questions remain unresolved. And perhaps that was precisely the point by 1945. The double programs had created such systematic uncertainty that even judicial proceedings designed to establish truth could only establish performance. Operation Paperclip, the American program to recruit German scientists after the war, is well known for bringing rocket scientists like Wernher von Braun to the United States. Less well known is what else Operation Paperclip recruited. Declassified documents from 2004 reveal that among the scientists brought to America were specialists in what was euphemistically termed identity engineering, the makeup artists, plastic surgeons, psychologists, and trainers who'd developed the Nazi double programs. Helmut Zimmermann, a theatrical makeup designer who'd worked at the Bavarian facility creating Hitler doubles, was brought to the United States in October 1946. His official specialty was listed as prosthetic development for wounded veterans. His actual assignment was to brief American intelligence on German double program techniques. Zimmermann's debriefing ran to over 400 pages, most of which remain classified. The unclassified portions discuss makeup techniques and prosthetic development, but scattered references hint at darker material. One declassified passage reads, "Subject confirms creation of at least 12 Hitler doubles between 1939 and 1945. Subject claims some doubles were used for security, others for deception operations, and at least 3 for what he termed autonomous command functions, meaning the doubles were authorized to make military decisions while performing as Hitler. Autonomous command functions, doubles who weren't just imitating Hitler but wielding his authority, making strategic decisions that affected the war's conduct. If Zimmermann's testimony was accurate, the Nazi command structure had been partially replaced by theatrical performance. Some of the orders that shaped the Eastern Front, the Battle of the Bulge, the final defense of Berlin, those orders might have come from actors performing Hitler rather than from Hitler himself. But here's what Zimmermann couldn't or wouldn't clarify. Which decisions came from doubles and which from the real Hitler? Did Hitler know his doubles were making autonomous decisions? Was the arrangement official policy, or had it evolved organically as Hitler's health deteriorated and his doubles filled the gap? Zimmermann died in 1953 in Los Angeles, officially from heart failure. But he'd been meeting regularly with CIA handlers until 2 weeks before his death, and the meeting's contents were classified at a level above top secret, a designation reserved for information whose revelation would cause exceptionally grave damage to national security. What information about German double programs could be so sensitive that it remained classified 80 years after the war's end? Unless that information related not just to historical German programs but to ongoing American programs that used the same techniques, faced the same moral questions, and created the same systematic uncertainty about who was really in command. The Berlin blockade, which began on June 24, 1948, when Soviet forces cut off Western access to Berlin, created the Cold War's first major crisis. Stalin's strategy was clear: starve West Berlin into submission, force Western powers to abandon the city, consolidate Soviet control over all of Berlin as a prelude to controlling all of Germany. The Allied response was the Berlin airlift flying in supplies to sustain the city's 2 million residents. The operation was a logistical miracle and a propaganda victory, demonstrating Western resolve without triggering military escalation. But something strange happened during those 10 months of blockade. Stalin appeared in multiple cities simultaneously, giving speeches that were broadcast on Soviet radio and reported in newspapers across Eastern Europe. On July 9, 1948, Stalin addressed workers at the Kirov plant in Leningrad about the necessity of maintaining pressure on Western imperialists. The speech was broadcast live on Radio Moscow at 3 post-meridiem. The same day, Stalin appeared at a military parade in Moscow's Red Square. Newsreel footage shows him standing atop Lenin's mausoleum reviewing troops. The parade began at 2 post-meridiem and concluded at 4:30 post-meridiem. Leningrad and Moscow are 400 miles apart. Even with immediate air transport, Stalin couldn't have appeared at both events on the same day with overlapping times. Linguistic analysis of the Leningrad speech, conducted decades later by defected Soviet specialists, revealed something fascinating. The speech used Georgian grammatical constructions that were characteristic of Stalin's natural speaking pattern, but different from Georgian constructions he'd used in earlier documented speeches. It was as if 2 different Georgian speakers, both fluent in Russian but with slightly different native language interference patterns, were performing Stalin. Western intelligence noticed these anomalies and compiled a report in September 1948, estimating Stalin was using at least 4 active doubles, possibly more. The report concluded, Stalin's ability to appear simultaneously in multiple locations provides significant psychological warfare advantage. Soviet citizens believe their leader is omnipresent, superhuman in his capacity for work. This belief strengthens regime legitimacy and makes resistance seem futile. But the report also noted something more troubling. We cannot determine with certainty whether Stalin is alive and deploying doubles, or whether Stalin is dead and doubles are, maintaining the illusion of his continued leadership. The Soviet system is sufficiently centralized and secretive that a collective leadership could govern through Stalin doubles indefinitely, with no one outside the innermost circle aware of the deception. This was the nightmare scenario, not that leaders used doubles occasionally for security and deception, but that doubles could entirely replace leaders while governments continued functioning as if nothing had changed. The possibility raised fundamental questions about political legitimacy. If Stalin's doubles were governing the Soviet Union, who actually held power? The doubles themselves? The handlers who controlled them? The collective leadership that had installed the doubles? And how would anyone know? If a double performs power convincingly enough, is the performance distinguishable from authentic power? In Argentina, between 1946 and 1952, something peculiar was happening in the expatriate German community. Hundreds of former Nazis had fled to South America after the war, some through official channels like the rat lines run by sympathetic Catholic clergy, others through their own resources. Argentina, under Juan Perón's government, was particularly welcoming to German emigrants, asking few questions about their wartime activities. But starting in 1948, local newspapers began reporting something odd. Multiple German emigrants were being recognized as the same person in different cities. A man identified as former SS officer Klaus Kruger was reportedly seen in Buenos Aires in March 1948. The same month, a man matching Kruger's description and using the same name was reported in Bariloche, 600 miles away. In April, Kruger appeared in Córdoba. In May, back in Buenos Aires. Similar reports appeared for dozens of other German emigrants. The same names, the same faces, appearing in multiple locations with impossible timing. The Argentine government investigated these reports casually and concluded they were cases of mistaken identity. Similar-looking Germans were being confused for each other by witnesses predisposed to see Nazis everywhere, but an alternative interpretation, suggested by Israeli intelligence documents declassified in 2006, was that Nazi war criminals were using doubles to confuse Nazi hunters and make tracking their movements impossible. The technique was simple. If you were a wanted Nazi in Argentina, you employed a double, another German emigrant who resembled you physically, to appear in your name at public locations. When Nazi hunters came looking, witnesses would report contradictory sightings. The confusion would obscure your real movements and make positive identification nearly impossible. The system worked surprisingly well. Argentine police files from the 1950s show dozens of cases where Nazi suspects were investigated but released because witness testimony was too contradictory to establish identity. Some witnesses swore the suspect was in Buenos Aires on a certain date. Other witnesses swore he was hundreds of miles away. Without reliable documentation, and many Germans had arrived with false papers, establishing identity became impossible. But here's where the story becomes more disturbing. Some of these doubles weren't just performing for Nazi hunters. They were living full-time as the people they were impersonating. Several cases emerged in the 1960s and 70s where Nazi war criminals were arrested, tried in Germany or Israel, convicted based on documentation and witness testimony, and then DNA evidence later suggested the convicted person wasn't actually the Nazi whose identity they bore. The most famous case involved a man identified as SS guard Ivan Demjanjuk, who was convicted in Israel in 1988, had his conviction overturned in 1993 when evidence suggested he might not be the Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, was then convicted in Germany in 2011 for different crimes, and died in 2012 still protesting that he'd been a victim of mistaken identity. The Demjanjuk case raised the troubling possibility that some post-war Nazi trials convicted doubles rather than the actual perpetrators. If sophisticated double programs had operated during the war, why wouldn't those same doubles be deployed afterward to serve as decoys, sacrificial surrogates who'd take the fall while real war criminals lived freely under different identities? The Israeli legal system struggled with this possibility. How do you pursue justice when identity itself has been systematically corrupted? How do you know you've captured the right person when the right person might be a performance maintained by the wrong person? The solution was to accept imperfect justice, to convict based on best available evidence while acknowledging that absolute certainty was impossible, to recognize that the double program's legacy wasn't just wartime deception, but permanent pollution of historical truth. Stalin's death on March 5, 1953, created the Cold War's greatest double mystery, one that Soviet archives still haven't fully clarified. The official account states, Stalin suffered a stroke on March 1st, was discovered unconscious on his bedroom floor, received medical attention that was mysteriously delayed, and died 4 days later surrounded by the Politburo. But the accounts of Stalin's death are contradictory in ways that suggest either severe confusion or deliberate deception. Lavrenti Beria, head of Soviet intelligence, claimed Stalin was found on March 2nd, not March 1st. Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs state Stalin was discovered on the morning of March 1st. Georgy Malenkov's testimony places the discovery in the evening of March 1st. The medical records show 3 different times of death: 3:50 ante-meridiem on March 5th, 9:50 post-meridiem on March 4th, and 6:30 post-meridiem on March 5th. Post-mortem examination revealed cause of death as cerebral hemorrhage, but later examination of the medical records suggested signs consistent with poisoning, specifically warfarin, a blood thinner that could cause fatal cerebral bleeding while appearing natural. And then there were the bodies. When Stalin's body was displayed publicly, lying in state in the Hall of Columns, several observers noted discrepancies. A physician who'd treated Stalin in the 1940s commented privately that the body's hands looked different, the fingers longer, the shape of the nails different. A Kremlin guard who'd seen Stalin regularly swore the corpse was shorter than Stalin had been. These observations were dismissed as the natural effects of death and embalming. Bodies change after death. Memory is unreliable. People see what they expect to see. But Kremlin guards reported something stranger. After Stalin's official death, 3 different bodies were moved through the Kremlin complex over the course of a week. The bodies were transported in closed coffins under heavy guard, destination unknown. One guard, who defected in 1961, testified, "We all knew Stalin used doubles. Everyone in the Kremlin knew. So when we were moving bodies after his death, we assumed they were clearing out the doubles, either disposing of them or preparing them for separate burials. But we counted 3 bodies that week, moved at different times, going to different locations. Only one body was publicly displayed. What happened to the others?" Western intelligence agencies, monitoring Soviet communications during the transition period, detected something equally odd. References to Stalin in intercepted messages continued for 2 days after his official death. On March 6, 24 hours after Stalin's death was publicly announced, a Soviet military transmission referenced Stalin's orders regarding troop deployments in East Germany. On March 7, a KGB communication mentioned Stalin's directive on a classified operation in Poland. Were these references to orders Stalin had given before death? Or was someone still issuing orders in Stalin's name, using the dead leader's authority to maintain control during the uncertain transition? Khrushchev, who emerged as Soviet leader after a power struggle with Beria and Malenkov, later gave a secret speech in 1956 denouncing Stalin's crimes. But he never addressed the questions around Stalin's death directly, never explained the contradictory accounts, never clarified what happened to Stalin's doubles. In fact, Khrushchev's secret speech contained one oblique reference that has puzzled historians. We must acknowledge that in Stalin's final years, there were moments when it was unclear who was actually issuing directives. The cult of personality had grown so extreme that even the personality itself became uncertain. What did Khrushchev mean? That Stalin's doubles had been issuing orders? That the collective leadership had been using Stalin's authority without Stalin's direct input? That Stalin himself had become so abstract, so performed, that distinguishing real Stalin from theatrical Stalin was impossible? The statement was vague enough to mean anything or nothing, and perhaps that vagueness was intentional, acknowledging the truth without confirming it, hinting at deception without documenting it. MKUltra, the CIA's mind control research program, began in 1953, the same year Stalin died, the same year the Korean War ended, the same year the Cold War entered a new phase of psychological and intelligence operations. MKUltra's declassified documents heavily redacted, with entire sub-projects remaining classified, reveal extensive research into hypnosis, drugs, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation. The stated goal was developing interrogation techniques and protecting American personnel from communist brainwashing. But one MKUltra sub-project, designated Project Gemini, focused specifically on identity manipulation and double creation. The project aimed to use LSD, hypnosis, and psychological conditioning to create controllable doubles, subjects who could be programmed to believe they were someone else, to adopt another person's identity so completely that they could pass expert scrutiny. Project Gemini's theoretical foundation came directly from studying wartime double programs. Researchers analyzed German, British, and Soviet techniques, looking for ways to accelerate the transformation process and create more reliable results. The project failed, according to declassified summaries. Subjects experienced severe psychological trauma. The identity transformations were unstable. Subjects would shift unpredictably between their original and assigned identities, or would reject both and create new identities entirely. Several subjects experienced complete psychotic breaks. The project was terminated in 1958, with researchers concluding that reliable identity manipulation required years of conditioning and couldn't be accelerated through drugs or hypnosis alone. But the declassified documents contain hints of something else. References to successful Gemini subjects appear in budget documents through 1962. Training facilities that should have been closed in 58 show expenditures through 64. And several CIA officers whose assignments should have ended with Project Gemini's termination remained on Gemini-related duties into the 1970s. What were these successful subjects? What were the Gemini-related duties that continued decades after the project officially ended? The most disturbing possibility is that Project Gemini didn't fail. It succeeded in creating some reliable doubles, and those doubles were deployed for operations that remain classified. That somewhere in the 1950s and 60s, CIA-created doubles were conducting operations while believing themselves to be different people entirely. And if the CIA was doing this, what were the Soviets doing? The Chinese? The British? Had the wartime double programs simply continued into the Cold War, evolving and improving, creating a permanent shadow layer of performed identities conducting secret operations? By 1953, 8 years after the war's end, at least 30 to 50 wartime doubles remained unaccounted for. Some had committed suicide. Some had been quietly retired with new identities. Some had simply disappeared into the chaos of post-war displacement, becoming untraceable among millions of refugees and migrants. But others had done something more disturbing. They'd continued performing their assigned identities long after the need for performance had ended. A Churchill double, identified through British intelligence files as Subject 7, continued living as Winston Churchill in a small village in Sussex until his death in 1961. He'd been retired from the program in 1946, given a modest pension, and relocated with instructions to assume a new identity. Instead, he'd continued smoking Churchill's cigars, speaking in Churchill's voice, reading Churchill's memoirs and incorporating them into his own memory. Villagers knew him as the Churchill man, eccentric, harmless, probably delusional, but entertaining enough that no one reported him to authorities. When he died, his cottage was found filled with Churchill memorabilia, photographs, recorded speeches playing on loop. His diary, spanning 15 years, was written entirely in first person, from Churchill's perspective, not as a Churchill double reflecting on his life, but as Churchill himself, with no acknowledgement that the writer was anyone else. The diary's final entry, dated 2 days before his death: "I've lived long enough, the war is won, the work is done, Britain endures, Churchill can rest now." He'd become Churchill so completely that he'd forgotten he was ever anyone else, and in that forgetting, he'd achieved the double program's ultimate goal, perfect performance maintained until death. But this raises the question that haunts all double programs. When a double forgets their original identity and becomes completely identified with their performance, have they really become that person? If Subject 7 believed himself to be Churchill, spent 15 years living as Churchill, and died as Churchill, was he Churchill? Not legally, not historically, but phenomenologically, experientially, in the only way that matters to subjective consciousness, yes, he was Churchill. Because Churchill was all he knew how to be. Multiply this case by dozens or hundreds doubles scattered across the world, some knowing themselves as doubles, others having forgotten or never knowing, all performing identities that had become more real than whatever identity preceded them. The war had ended, but it had created a generation of ghosts, men who existed only as shadows of other men, who had no authentic self to return to because their authentic selves had been systematically destroyed. And these ghosts were still walking through history in 1953, still performing, still deceiving, still uncertain whether they were real or merely shadows pretending to cast their own light. The double programs had achieved their objectives. They'd protected leaders, deceived enemies, enabled strategic operations. But they'd also done something else, something that couldn't be measured in military victories or intelligence successes. They demonstrated that identity itself was theatrical, that human personality could be engineered and manipulated, that the boundary between authentic and performed self was more porous than anyone wanted to believe, and that knowledge, that terrible, destabilizing knowledge, was now loose in the world, available to any government or organization willing to pursue it. The shadows born in 1939 hadn't died in 1945. They'd simply learned to hide better, to perform more subtly, to exist in the spaces between official acknowledgement and private knowledge. And they were still there, still watching, still waiting for someone to notice what everyone already knew but no one dared say. The people we think we're seeing might not be who they appear to be, and we might never know the difference. The skull fragment sat in a cardboard box in the Russian state archives for 64 years, labeled simply Hitler, Adolf, cranial remains, May 1945. Soviet forces had recovered the fragment from the Reich Chancellery Garden along with other remains, transported it to Moscow, and stored it as proof of Hitler's death evidence to counter the conspiracy theories that inevitably sprouted in the absence of a complete, verifiable body. For decades, the fragment served its purpose. Soviet officials would occasionally reference it. "We have Hitler's skull. The matter is settled. Hitler died in the bunker." In 2008, American archaeologist Nick Bellantoni was granted unprecedented access to examine the fragment using modern forensic techniques. The results, published in 2009, were startling. DNA analysis revealed the skull fragment belonged to a woman between 20 and 40 years old. Not Hitler, not even male. A woman of unknown identity whose skull fragment had been misidentified or deliberately mislabeled as belonging to the Führer. The revelation reignited every conspiracy theory about Hitler's survival, but it also raised more subtle, more disturbing questions. If Soviet forensics had examined this fragment in 1945 and declared it Hitler's, were they incompetent, deceived, or deliberately creating false evidence? And if they were creating false evidence, why? To hide that they'd never found Hitler's body? To conceal that the body they'd found was a double? To maintain useful ambiguity about Hitler's fate for propaganda purposes? Russian officials responded to Bellantoni's findings with carefully worded statements, suggesting the skull fragment might have been mislabeled, that other remains in Soviet archives could be authentic Hitler material, but that access to those remains was restricted for preservation reasons. Translation: "We're not showing you the other evidence. You'll have to accept our word. Or not." The situation crystallized the double program's lasting legacy, permanent uncertainty built into the historical record, questions that could never be definitively answered because the evidence itself had been systematically corrupted. Vasily Mitrokhin's defection from the KGB in 1992 brought thousands of pages of copied Soviet intelligence documents to the West, revelations about espionage operations, active measures, and covert programs spanning decades. Buried in the Mitrokhin archive were fragments of documents related to Soviet double programs, most heavily redacted even in the declassified versions. But what remained was suggestive enough to reshape understanding of Stalin's final years. According to Mitrokhin's materials, Stalin employed doubles continuously from 1934 until his death, not just for security, but as an integrated governance mechanism. By 1950, Stalin's health had deteriorated significantly. He suffered from atherosclerosis, hypertension, and possibly dementia. His ability to work extended periods was diminished. The doubles filled the gaps. When Stalin was incapacitated by illness, doubles conducted routine meetings, signed documents, made appearances at public events. The practice had become so systematic that senior Soviet officials learned to distinguish which Stalin they were dealing with based on subtle cues, vocabulary choices, body, language, decision-making patterns. But here's what Mitrokhin's documents suggested. In Stalin's final 2 years, 1951 to 53, the doubles may have been running most day-to-day governance. One document fragment reads, Subject 4 demonstrated increasing autonomy in decision-making, particularly regarding economic policy. Decisions attributed to Comrade Stalin regarding agricultural quotas in Ukraine were made by Subject 4 based on briefing materials, without direct consultation. Results were within acceptable parameters and were not countermanded. Subject 4, a Stalin double, was making agricultural policy for Ukraine. Decisions that affected millions of lives. Decisions attributed to Stalin, made by an actor performing Stalin, while the real Stalin was where? Ill? Senile? Already dead? Another fragment, dated March 1952, references coordination challenges among active subjects. Translation: multiple Stalin doubles were operating simultaneously, and their handlers were struggling to keep their decisions consistent. If Mitrokhin's documents are accurate, and Western intelligence agencies generally regard the archive as highly reliable, then the Soviet Union, in its final Stalin years, was governed partly by theatrical performance. Policy decisions came from doubles. Government orders bore Stalin's authority, but originated from actors briefed by handlers who were themselves interpreting Stalin's likely preferences. The implications are staggering. The Soviet Union, a nuclear superpower in the early Cold War, was being steered by shadows, while its actual leader declined into physical and mental deterioration. And if this was happening in the Soviet Union, what was happening elsewhere? Was this unique to Stalin's paranoia and the Soviet system's secrecy? Or was it a common phenomenon in aging leadership everywhere, hidden behind official denials and state secrecy? Operation Mongoose, the CIA's campaign to destabilize Castro's Cuba, ran from 1961 to 64 and included some of the agency's most creative and absurd assassination plots: exploding cigars, poison pens, contaminated diving suits. But declassified documents from 2007 revealed another component: the Castro double operation. The CIA planned to create doubles of Fidel Castro for multiple purposes. One purpose was infiltration, placing a Castro double in Cuba to issue false orders, create confusion, discredit the real Castro by having the double commit outrageous acts. Another purpose was more straightforward: assassination by substitution. If a Castro double could be created and inserted, Cuban security wouldn't know which Castro to protect. The confusion might create opportunities for actual assassination. At minimum, it would force Castro to question everyone around him, creating paranoia that would degrade his effectiveness. The operation never advanced beyond planning stages, according to declassified summaries. The CIA concluded that Cuban security was too sophisticated, that Castro's distinctive appearance and mannerisms would be too difficult to replicate convincingly, that the operation's risks outweighed potential benefits. But the planning documents revealed something else. The CIA had developed sophisticated double creation capabilities by the early 1960s. The techniques described in Mongoose planning materials were far advanced from wartime programs: better prosthetics, more effective psychological conditioning, surgical procedures that could more reliably alter bone structure. And the techniques were described not as theoretical possibilities but as established capabilities. The CIA knew how to create convincing doubles because they'd been doing it. The question was whether creating a Castro double was feasible given operational constraints, not whether the agency possessed the basic capability. Which raises the obvious question: if the CIA could create convincing doubles by 1961, and if they chose not to use this capability against Castro, where did they use it? The documents don't say. Entire sections referencing previous double operations are redacted. References to ongoing programs are blacked out. The evidence suggests active double programs were running in the early 60s, but their targets, purposes, and outcomes remain classified. We know the CIA could create doubles. We know they considered using doubles against foreign leaders. We know they decided not to use doubles against Castro specifically. What we don't know is who else they targeted. How many foreign leaders in the 1960s were replaced, infiltrated, or impersonated by CIA doubles? How many diplomatic meetings, treaty negotiations, or international agreements involved people who weren't who they appeared to be? The historical record is silent, the documents are redacted, and the silence itself is revealing, confirming that something happened, even while concealing what that something was. William Tuttle's deathbed confession in 2009 should have been dismissed as the ramblings of a 94-year-old man in morphine-induced delirium. Tuttle had been a makeup artist at MGM, worked on hundreds of films, and had served as a military consultant during World War II. His career was distinguished but not remarkable. His death, in a Los Angeles nursing home surrounded by family, should have been unremarkable too. Except Tuttle had called a lawyer 2 days before his death and insisted on making a recorded statement. The lawyer, initially reluctant, eventually agreed. The recording, obtained by researchers in 2011, runs 47 minutes. Most of it is standard deathbed reflection, career memories, family appreciation, spiritual concerns. But starting at minute 32, Tuttle discusses something else. "I need to tell someone before I die. I helped create doubles of President Roosevelt. Not for films. For real. I was brought in by military intelligence in 1943. They needed someone who understood makeup but also understood motion, how faces move, how expressions build and fade. Hollywood makeup people knew things medical people didn't. I worked on 3 Roosevelt doubles that year. The goal was making them camera-ready for newsreels and photographs. But one of them, Subject 9, we called him, was being prepared for something more. He was learning Roosevelt's mannerisms, his voice, his decision-making patterns. They were preparing him to actually be Roosevelt if needed. In February 1945, I was called to help prepare Subject 9 for the Yalta Conference. They said Roosevelt's health was bad, that he might not be able to attend the whole conference, that Subject 9 needed to be ready to fill in during less crucial sessions. I don't know if that happened. I wasn't at Yalta, but I prepared Subject 9 specifically for that conference. And when I saw photographs from Yalta afterward, some of them looked like Roosevelt to me, but some looked like Subject 9 doing Roosevelt. The bone structure was slightly different if you knew what to look for. The way the skin folded around his eyes when he smiled was different. I think Subject 9 went to Yalta. I think he participated in at least some of the sessions, which means some of the decisions about post-war Europe, about the United Nations, about Soviet occupation zones. Those decisions might have been made by an actor from Cleveland who'd been trained to imitate the president. I don't know that for certain, but I think it's true, and it's bothered me for 64 years. The recording ends with Tuttle crying, apologizing to his family, saying he'd kept the secret too long and wasn't sure anymore what was real and what he'd convinced himself he remembered. Historians have struggled with Tuttle's confession. He was elderly, dying, medicated. Deathbed confessions are notoriously unreliable. But Tuttle's wartime service with military consultants is documented. His access to classified projects is confirmed in his service records, and his technical descriptions of makeup techniques match classified materials from the period. Photographic analysis of Yalta conference images has yielded contradictory results. Some analysts see subtle variations in Roosevelt's appearance across different photographs, variations that could be explained by lighting, camera angles, and health fluctuations, or could indicate different individuals. Facial recognition software, applied in 2013 by researchers at the University of Michigan, found anomalies in 17 different Yalta photographs. The software, designed to detect whether multiple photographs show the same individual, flagged certain images as possibly different subjects, with confidence levels ranging from 62 to 89%. The researchers concluded cautiously, while software limitations and historical photograph quality prevent definitive conclusions, the data suggest the possibility that not all Roosevelt photographs from Yalta show the same individual. Alternative explanations, including photographic artifacts, lighting variations, and Roosevelt's documented health issues, may account for the anomalies. Possibility. May account for the language of uncertainty that characterizes all research into double programs. We have a deathbed confession. We have photographic anomalies. We have documented evidence that Roosevelt doubles existed and were trained for high-level impersonation. What we don't have is proof. We have suggestions, implications, possibilities. And perhaps that's all we'll ever have, the legacy of programs designed specifically to make certainty impossible. The children and grandchildren of doubles began finding each other in the late 1990s as internet genealogy research and DNA testing made connections possible that had been impossible before. In 1998, a woman in Hampshire discovered her grandfather had been a Churchill double. Family stories had always suggested grandfather had done something secret in the war, but the family assumed it was standard intelligence work. DNA testing, done for ancestry research, revealed something odd. Her grandfather showed genetic markers consistent with surgical grafts, suggesting he'd received tissue transplants from multiple sources during his lifetime. Further research into sealed medical records accessible only through court order revealed extensive plastic surgery performed between 1940 and 45. The surgery had altered her grandfather's facial structure to more closely match Churchill's. The grafts included cartilage, skin tissue, and even bone fragments harvested from cadavers or medical sources. Her grandfather had literally been rebuilt to become Churchill, and he'd lived with that reconstruction for 40 more years after the war, his face a permanent reminder of identity he'd performed. The woman began connecting with others online who'd discovered similar family secrets. By 2001, they'd formed an informal association, descendants of confirmed or suspected doubles, comparing family stories, sharing documents, trying to piece together what had happened to their grandfathers and great-grandfathers. The stories they collected painted a consistent picture. Men who returned from war as strangers, men who spoke languages they'd never learned before, military service, German doubles who'd learned Russian, British doubles who'd learned German, all trained in enemy languages to better impersonate enemy leaders in psychological operations. Men who had skills and knowledge unexplained by their official service records. One woman in Moscow described her grandfather, allegedly a factory worker who'd served in the Red Army, returning from war fluent in Georgian Stalin's native language and occasionally speaking in Georgian during nightmares, using vocabulary and phrases that suggested intimate knowledge of Stalin's childhood. Another man in Germany described his grandfather, who'd supposedly been a clerk, returning with detailed knowledge of Hitler's daily routines, favorite foods, and personal habits, knowledge no clerk should possess. The descendants shared medical records showing extensive plastic surgery, psychological treatment for identity disorders, and in several cases, commitment to psychiatric facilities. Many of their ancestors had struggled with what we'd now call dissociative identity disorder, PTSD, and severe depression, and they shared letters, diaries, and deathbed confessions. Men who'd finally told their families the truth about what they'd done, who they'd been, and how thoroughly their identities had been erased. One letter, written by a British Churchill double to his son in 1973, 3 weeks before the double's suicide. I need you to understand something. When I came home from war, I wasn't your father anymore. Your father, the man who left in 1939, died sometime in 1941. I don't know exactly when. Maybe there was a specific moment when he ceased to exist, or maybe it was gradual, but by 1942, he was gone. The man who came home was someone else, someone who knew how to be Winston Churchill but had forgotten how to be himself. I've spent 30 years trying to remember who I was, trying to be a father and husband to people who knew someone I can't remember being. You deserve a real father. Your mother deserved a real husband, but I'm not real. I'm a performance that outlived its purpose, and I'm tired of performing. The letter was found beside his body. The man had hanged himself in his garage, using rope tied in a specific knot. Churchill had been known to use for nautical purposes, a skill the man had learned during double training and had never forgotten, even though he'd forgotten his own children's birthdays. These stories multiplied as descendants connected with each other, each story unique in its details but sharing common themes: identity destruction, psychological damage, men who'd sacrificed not just years of their lives but their very selves to the war effort. The descendants began advocating for official recognition, for declassification of double program records, for acknowledgement that their ancestors had served their countries in ways that deserved remembrance. Governments resisted. Double programs remained classified. Records stayed sealed. Official histories continued to omit or minimize the double operations. Because acknowledging the doubles meant acknowledging what the doubles revealed, that identity was fungible, that leadership was theatrical, that the people who'd won the war might not have been who everyone thought they were. Better to leave the doubles in shadow. Better to let their descendants wonder and speculate. Better to maintain the official narratives, even if those narratives were performances as elaborate as the doubles themselves. A 2018 archaeological excavation at the Reich Chancellery bunker site, now buried under a parking lot in Berlin, made a discovery that German authorities initially tried to suppress. 3 distinct sets of dental remains were recovered from soil that forensic analysis dated to April-May 1945. All 3 sets showed characteristics consistent with Hitler's known dental work: the distinctive bridge on his upper jaw, the specific pattern of fillings, the missing teeth from earlier dental problems. But they were 3 different sets of remains, from 3 different individuals, each matching some aspects of Hitler's dental records but not others, as if Hitler's mouth had been reconstructed 3 times with slight variations. The discovery suggested what many had suspected. Multiple Hitler bodies had been prepared for discovery, each one a double killed and planted to create forensic confusion, to ensure that even if remains were found and examined, positive identification would be impossible. The German government initially classified the discovery under national security protocols, arguing that publicizing it would fuel neo-Nazi conspiracy theories and undermine historical consensus about Hitler's death. But the archaeological team leaked the findings to media, forcing official acknowledgement. The government's response was carefully calibrated. Yes, multiple remains were found. Yes, they showed similarities to Hitler's dental records. But this likely reflected Nazi preparations, double bodies prepared for discovery in case Hitler escaped, not evidence that Hitler actually escaped. The remains proved the double program's existence and sophistication, the government argued, but didn't prove Hitler survived. The logic was sound but unsatisfying. It confirmed extensive deception while using that deception to argue against deeper deception. It acknowledged doubles while insisting the primary subject remained authentic, and it left the fundamental question unanswered: which body was real, if any? Had Hitler died as officially recorded, with doubles prepared but unused, or had he escaped while doubles died in his place? Or had he died earlier than officially recorded, with doubles maintaining the performance until the end? The remains themselves couldn't answer. Dental work could be duplicated. Bodies could be prepared, and 3 sets of remains created 3 times as much confusion as they resolved. Mission accomplished, from the double program's perspective. Even 73 years later, even with modern forensic science, the deception held. In 2020, Russian President Vladimir Putin made a startling admission during a press conference, responding to a question about wartime history. Our archives contain films of 5 different Stalins, giving contradictory orders during the Kiev. Same week in 1945, Putin said, "This is documented fact. The double program was real. Its scope was larger than previously acknowledged." The statement was unprecedented, the first time any Russian leader had officially confirmed the Stalin double program's extent. Western historians and journalists immediately requested access to the films. Putin refused. "These materials remain classified for national security reasons," he explained. "Their release would complicate relationships with other nations whose own programs are documented in the same files." The implication was clear. Russian archives contained evidence not just of Soviet doubles, but of British, American, and other nations' programs. Releasing the Stalin materials would require releasing materials about everyone's programs, a mutual assured destruction of historical narratives that no government wanted. Putin's statement served multiple purposes. It acknowledged what everyone already knew or suspected, demonstrating transparency while actually revealing nothing. It confirmed the double program's existence while keeping their details secret, and it implicitly threatened other nations. "We could release this material. We could expose everyone's deceptions. But we won't, as long as you don't push us." The revelation without information, the confirmation without evidence, the admission that changed nothing because it confirmed what couldn't be denied while concealing everything that mattered. Historians noted the metatextual irony. Putin's statement about Stalin's doubles came at a time when Putin himself rarely appeared in public without extensive security, when his appearances were carefully staged and controlled, when speculation about Putin doubles had become common in Russian opposition circles. Was Putin admitting historical truth to deflect from present deception? Was he confirming Stalin's doubles to normalize the concept of leadership doubles? Was he suggesting that what happened in Stalin's time was happening now, or that what happened then was unique and could never happen in modern transparent society? The statement raised more questions than it answered, and perhaps that was precisely its purpose: to create uncertainty, to make people question what they knew, to demonstrate that truth was whatever state power declared it to be. The double program's ultimate legacy, not just past deception, but present uncertainty about whether the past was really past or had simply evolved into more sophisticated forms. Facial recognition software has revolutionized many aspects of security and identification, but when applied to historical photographs and film footage, it has revealed patterns that challenge official narratives. In 2015, researchers at MIT applied advanced facial recognition algorithms to wartime photographs of world leaders. The software analyzed bone structure, facial proportions, and distinctive features that remained consistent regardless of aging, lighting, or expression. The Churchill analysis identified 17 instances where facial bone structure was mathematically implausible to reconcile with other verified Churchill photographs. The software flagged these images as either photographic distortions, artifacts of camera technology and processing, or as different individuals. Manual examination suggested photographic distortion couldn't explain all anomalies. Some images showed bone structure variations too significant for any known photographic artifact. Similar analysis of Hitler photographs found 38 anomalies. Stalin photographs yielded 41. Roosevelt photographs showed 23. The researchers published their findings cautiously, noting technical limitations and emphasizing that anomalies didn't necessarily indicate different individuals. But the pattern was clear. Wartime photographs of major leaders showed more facial inconsistency than could be easily explained. The implications troubled both historians and intelligence communities. If significant percentages of wartime leader photographs showed different individuals, how do we write accurate history? How do we know who did what? How do we attribute decisions, speeches, or actions to specific people when the photographic record is corrupted? And more troubling, if wartime photographs are unreliable, what about contemporary photographs? Modern facial recognition software is far more sophisticated than wartime doubles could have anticipated. Could contemporary leaders withstand the same analysis? Or would similar patterns emerge, suggesting that double programs never ended, just improved? Several governments quietly contacted the MIT researchers, requesting they not publish detailed methodology or share their software tools publicly. The concern, expressed diplomatically, was that such tools could compromise security of current leaders. The researchers complied, publishing only general findings and withholding technical details. But they noted privately to colleagues that government concern seemed focused less on preventing adversaries from identifying doubles and more on preventing public verification of doubles' existence. The technology existed to definitively test whether historical photographs showed authentic individuals or doubles. The technology could answer 80 years of questions, but the political will to actually conduct those tests and publish results was absent. Because perhaps some questions are more useful unanswered. Perhaps uncertainty serves purposes that certainty would undermine. Perhaps the double program's greatest success was creating permanent doubt about whether what we see is real. The technology to definitively resolve these questions exists. DNA testing could confirm identities of excavated remains. Facial recognition software could analyze all surviving photographs and film. Dental records, medical records, and forensic analysis could establish which bodies were real and which were prepared doubles. But the political will to conduct this research and publish results remains absent. Every government with relevant archives has classified materials. Every intelligence service has reasons to keep those materials classified. Every nation that used doubles has interest in maintaining official narratives rather than revealing the full scope of deception. The result is what one historian termed enforced ambiguity, a situation where truth could be established but is deliberately kept uncertain for political reasons. Archives remain sealed, records stay classified, DNA testing is refused or limited, research is discouraged or defunded, and the questions multiply rather than resolve. Perhaps the greatest victory of the double programs was not the deceptions they achieved during the war, but the permanent uncertainty they created about all leadership, all authority, all apparently authentic human identity in public life. We know doubles existed. We know they operated extensively. We know they influenced military operations and political decisions. We know some became so integrated into command structures that distinguishing their actions from their principals' actions became impossible. What we don't know, what we may never know, is the full extent. How many doubles? Operating for how long? Making which decisions? Governing how much of the world? And underlying all these questions is the most disturbing one. If doubles were so prevalent in wartime, so successful, so deeply integrated into governance structures, why would they have stopped after the war? The infrastructure existed. The expertise was preserved. The techniques improved. The strategic value was proven. Every reason to use doubles in wartime applied equally to Cold War intelligence operations, to diplomatic negotiations, to domestic political leadership. So the question isn't whether double programs continued after 1945. The question is whether they ever really ended at all, or simply became more sophisticated, more deeply embedded, more thoroughly classified. Perhaps somewhere in Russia, or America, or Britain, or China, there are files documenting continuous double operations from 1939 to present day. Perhaps the wartime programs didn't end but merely evolved, adapting to new technologies and new political contexts. Perhaps the leaders we see today, making decisions that shape our world, are who they appear to be. Or perhaps some are performances, maintained by shadows trained so thoroughly that even they no longer remember who they were before they became someone else. We have no way to know for certain, and perhaps that's exactly the point. The double programs taught us that identity is performance, that authority is theatrical, that truth is whatever can be made believable. They taught us to doubt our own perceptions, to question what we see, to accept that reality and appearance might be fundamentally distinct. And once learned, that lesson cannot be unlearned. Once we know leadership can be theatrical, we can never fully trust that any leader is authentic. Once we understand identity can be engineered, we can never be certain anyone is who they claim to be. The shadows born in 1939 cast darkness that has never lifted. They walk among us still, whether as actual doubles or as the possibility of doubles, which amounts to the same thing in terms of psychological effect. We live in the world the double programs created, a world where seeing is not believing, where trust is impossible, where every face might be a mask and every voice might be a performance. They won, not the Germans or the Russians or the British or the Americans. The shadows themselves won. By making us unable to distinguish shadow from substance, they ensured their own immortality. And in the darkness they created, new shadows are always forming, always performing, always waiting for someone to notice, what everyone already knows, but no one dares acknowledge. The person you think you're looking at might not exist at all, and you'd never know the difference. That's the legacy. That's the victory. That's the eternal question that will never be answered because the answer would be too destabilizing to accept. Who are we really seeing? Who's really in charge? Who's real and who's performed? We don't know. We can't know, and perhaps we never will. The shadows have won by making winning and losing indistinguishable, by making truth and deception the same, by making us all complicit in the performance, by making us unable to distinguish performance from reality. The war ended 80 years ago, but the shadow war continues. It always will, as long as we keep asking questions no one wants answered. As long as the shadows keep whispering what we already know but can't prove. Nothing is what it seems. No one is who they appear. And the greatest deception is making you believe deception is over. The mirrors are infinite. The reflections never end. And somewhere in that hall of mirrors, the truth exists unknowable, unreachable, eternal, just like the shadows themselves.